In the sulfide lamps she looked transparent, and she was leaning heavily on crutches. Her heavy curls had been tied up on top of her head, revealing a neck that looked ready to snap in a strong wind. Behind her hoped Betrayal, who in the darkness looked like a mannequin with ABS. Next to Gideon, Harrow Hark stiffened very slightly. Ghosts and monsters. The Lady of the Seventh continued enthusiastically. Remnants in the dead, the disturbed dead. The idea that someone is still here and furious, or that something has been lurking here forever. Maybe it's that I find the idea comforting that thousands of years after you're gone is when you really live, that your echo is louder than your voice. Harrow said, a spirit comes at invitation. It cannot sustain itself. But what if one could? Cried Dulcinea. That's so much more interesting than plain murder this time. Neither of the ninth answered. Dulcinea moved forward, pressing her forearms into the clutches of her two metal poles, and blinked soft brown lashes at them. Gideon noticed that she looked tired still, that the veins at her temple stood out, that her hand shook just a little bit on each crutch. She was wrapped up in a robe of some pale blue stuff embroidered with flowers, but still shivered with the chill. Greetings, ninth. You're brave to come down here after what teacher said. One might said Harry say the same of you. Oh, by all rights, I ought to have been the first one to die, said Dulcinea, giggling a bit frightfully. But once one accepts that, one stops worrying quite so much. It would be so predictable to bump me off. Hello, Gideon. It's nice to see you again. I mean, I saw you last night, but you know what I mean. Oh no, now I sound like a dope. Still vowing silence before that line of conversation could be pursued, the dark-hooded necromancer of the ninth said in her most sepulchrous and forbidding tones, we have business down here, Lady Septimus. Excuse us, but that's just what I came to talk to you about, said the other necromancer earnestly. I think we should team up. Gideon could not hide an explosive snort of disbelief. There were maybe less likely targets for her to team up with. Silas Sock to kiss her on, maybe, or Teacher, or the dead body of Magnus Quinn. In fact, Teacher would be a far better candidate. But Dulcinea's dreamy blue eyes returned on her, and she said, I've already completed one of the serum labs. I think I'm on the path to cracking another if we both work together by then. There's the key in half the time, with just a few hours' work. This is not intended to be collaborative, Dulcinea said smilingly. Why does everybody think that the women sized each other up? Dulcinea, leaning into her metal braces, looked like a Bristol doll. Harrow, hooded and swayed in miles of black fabric, like a wraith. When she pulled away the hood, the older necromancer did not flinch. Even though it was a deliberately chilling sight, the dark cropped head, the stark paint on the face, the bone studs punched halfway up each ear. Harrow said coolly, what would be in it for the ninth house? All my knowledge of the theory and the demonstration and first use of the key, said Dulcinea, eagerly generous. What would be in it for the seventh? The key. Once you're done, you see, I don't think I can physically do this one. Stupidity, then not generosity. You just told me you can't complete it. Nothing would stop my house from completing it without you. It took me a long time to work out the theoretical parameters for Dulcinea, so I wish you the best of luck, because even though I'm dying, there's nothing wrong with my brain. Arrow pulled the hood back over her head, returning her to a wraith, a piece of smoke. She swept past the frail necromancer of the seventh, who followed her with the wistful, somewhat hungry expression that Dulcinea reserved for the shadowy nuns of the ninth, for the black robes whispering on the metal floor, the green light reflecting off dark fabric. Harrow Hark turned around and said curtly, well, are we doing this or not, Lady Septimus? Oh, thank you, Dulcinea, said Gideon, was stupefied. Too many shocks in 24 hours shut down her thought processes as Dulcinea stumped along the corridor, crutches clanging unharmoniously on the grill, and as Pritzelwa hovered behind her a half step away, as though desperate to just scoop her up and carry her, Gideon strode to catch up with her necromancer, only to find her swearing under her breath. Arrow whispered a lot of fuck words before muttering, thank God we got to her first. I never thought you'd actually help out, Sir. Gideon grudgingly admiring. Are you dim as terror? If we didn't agree that bleeding heart's sex just would, and he'd have the key. Oh, whoops, my bad, said Gideon. For a moment I thought you weren't a huge bitch. They followed the mismatched pair from the seventh house to the dusty facility hub filled with its dusty paneling and its whiteboard gleaming sadly beneath big white lights. Dulcinea turned abruptly down the passageway marked Laboratory 710, a tunnel identical to the one they had taken to Laboratory 13 this time. The creaks and ancient moons of the building seemed very loud, their footsteps a huge addition to the cacophony in the middle of a passage past the first laboratory rooms. The grill on the floor had been staved and cracked right down the middle to come to rest on hissing pipes. Protester Lois picked up his adept and stepped her over this bit. As lightly as thistledown, Gideon jumped the gap and turned back to see her necromancer hesitating on the edge, stranded. Why she did it, Gideon didn't know. Hera could have built herself a bridge of bones any second, but she grasped the reining, leaned over and proffered her hand. Why Hera took it was an even bigger mystery. After being helped cross, Hera spent a few moments efficiently dusting herself off and muttering inarticulately. Then she strode off to catch up with, of all people, Protest Alaus, apparently with the aim of engaging him in conversation. Dulcinea, who had taken a moment to fit herself back into her crutches, slipped one arm into Gideon's. Instead, she nodded at the broad span of her cavalier's back column. "The 8th is fixing to fight him tomorrow," she said to Gideon beneath her breath. "I wish Master Silas had just fought me. Not much can hurt me anymore. It would be an interesting sensation, is what I mean." In response, Gideon's grip tightened around the languid arm tucked in her own. Dulcinea sighed, which sounded like air being pushed through wistly sponges up this close. Her hair was very soft. Gideon noted dimly, "I know I was an idiot to let it happen, but the 8th is so touchy in their own way. And Probe was unpardonably bad. They couldn't let the insult pass. I just let my worst instincts get the better of me." And yelped. The curly-haired necromancer paused to cough, as though simply remembering how she dealt was enough to send her into spasms. Gideon instinctively put an arm around her shoulders, studying her so that the crutches did not give way, and found herself looking down where the edge of Dulcinea's shirt met her bulging collarbones. A fine chain around her neck supported a rather less delicate bundle hanging tucked into her camisole. Gideon only saw them for a second, but she knew immediately what they were. The keyring was snapped around the chain, and on the keyring were two keys: the sawtooth touch key and a thick gray key with unpretentious teeth, the kind you'd lock a cabinet with. She made herself look anywhere else. By now they had reached the very end of the corridor, which terminated in a single door marked Laboratory 8. Wriggling 3 of Gideon's arm, Dulcinea opened it onto a little foyer alike in indignity to Laboratory 2. There were hooks on the walls here, and a bunch of old crumpled boxes made of thin metal, the type you might carry files in. These were dented and empty. Someone had taken the time and effort to affix a beautiful swirl of human teeth above the door in a widening spiral of size in the center. The neat little shovels of incisors tessellated with arched canines and ringed all around with the long racini tusks of molars in neat print. The label on the door read No 14-8 Diversion Procedural Chamber. Beneath the neat print, a more elaborate hand had written in fainter ink, "Avulsion here we are," said Dulcinea. "Before we go through, please give me a little bit of your blood. I have mortared the place up and down, and I'm dreadfully afraid you won't be able to go through the door without giving me a shock." This little nod to paranoia made Harrow's shoulders relax. Minutely, Gideon looked to her, and Harrow Hark nodded. In the dim and dusty foyer, both offered up their hands to be pricked. The necromancer of the 7th tilted her head, beautiful brown ringlets spilling over her shoulders, and took blood from their thumbs and their ring fingers. Then she pressed the blood into her palm and spat delicately with what Gideon noticed was pink-tinged spittle. She pressed her thin hand to the door. "It's not a hold ward," Dulcinea explained, "but it's not just physical. The ward will alert me if the immaterial try to pass. If they've instantiated, I mean if they've crossed over. I don't want to stop them," she added, when Harold Hark started fidgeting with a bone fragment from her pocket. "I want to see whatever would try to sneak in on us. I want to know what it looks like. Let's go," rather than the neatly sectional space that had constituted Laboratory 2, with its imaging and response chambers and orderly empty shelves. Laboratory 8 opened up on an enormous grate. A lattice of thick black steel barred the first part of the room from the second, which aspired through the holes. Proved to be a long space with a claustrophobic ceiling. It was like stepping into a pipe. The door led to a metal platform on struts and a short flight of stairs leading down into the space barred by the huge grate. The 7th necromancer went to the wall and flicked to switch, and with a low vibrating moan, the grate slowly began to tuck itself up into the ceiling. With the removal of the grate, the room seemed Enormously gray and empty, only two things broke up the vast monotony of gray metal and white light. Far off at the other end of the chamber was a metal plinth boxed on top with what looks like clear glass or plex, and at the bottom of the stairs, about a meter away from its base, was a yellow and black striped line that had been painted horizontally from wall to wall. It was easily 100 meters from the stripe to the plinth, a long way to walk. It looked simple enough, which was how Gideon knew it was probably a huge pain in the ass, and yet her adept was already gliding down the stairs, standing before the yellow and black emblazoned line, as though at the edge of a fire. Dulcinea came after, leaning more heavily on her crutches. As she swung herself down the stairs, Prytezalawas came last. "If you put your hand through," she said, "you'll see there." Her head bitten off. A cry of pain. She had stuck her gloved fingers tentatively over the line, and now she was yanking off her glove. To see the damage. Gideon had been the victim of this once before through calamities sextus, but it was still a disquieting sight. Harris' fingertips had shriveled, the nails had split horribly, and the moisture looked as though it had been siphoned, forcibly out, wrinkling the skin like paper. Her adept shook her hand in the air like you would with a burn. The wrinkles smoothed out slowly, and the nails knit themselves back together. "Hardly insurmountable," said her, having regained her composure. "Very hopeful. What would you use?" "A corporeal ward, skin-bound, tight focus. Try it." Harrow Hark flexed her fingers slowly. Gideon watched as she narrowed her eyes into obsidian slits, fringed thickly with blunt black lashes, and then extended her hand. Beyond the line again, there was a brief shower of blue sparks. Harrow snatched her hand back, amazed and furious. The fingers had withered into puckered twigs. Her little nail had fallen off entirely. The edges of her sleeve had holed and frayed as though assaulted by moths. Gideon lunged out of a sheer desire to do something, but Harrow held her back with her healthy hand, staring fixably at the hurt one as it slowly mended. Dulcinea watched with eager eyes. Prytezalawas hulk next to the stairs. Harry shook a bracelet over her hurt hand, and bands of spongy osseous matter wrapped around her knuckles before forming thick plaques of bone. Gauntleted, she reached her hand out again. "It won't work," said Dulcinea, dimpling. The gauntlet exploded into fragments of bone. Those that passed the yellow line fragmented further, and those bits degraded into dust, and that into powder. The glove fell away in hunks, dwindling into fine sand before it even hit the ground, and Harrow yanked her hand back to stare at its sad, puckered appearance. A third time she sat heavily on the stairs, and a bead of blood sweat trickled down one temple as away from the barrier her hand relaxed back into wholeness. Gideon longed to say, "What the fuck, it's two spells overlaying each other," said Dulcinea. "You can't have two spells with coterminous bounds is impossible." But true, they're really coterminous, not just interwoven or spliced. It's truly delicious work. The people who set it in place with genius is then one half is senescence, and the other half is an entropy field. Such Dulcinea simply. Gideon followed Harrow's gaze over the long, dolly gleaming field of corrugated metal, and the plinth shining at the end like a beacon. She saw her suck in and bite the inside of one cheek, always a sign of furious thinking, flexing her fingers all the while as they're still worried about their integrity. She took an old ivory-colored knuckle from her pocket, and she passed it to Gideon. "Throw," she commanded. Gideon obliging me through. It was a good toss. The knuckle hit the field high and traveled for about half a meter before fragmenting into a rain of gray particles. Harris' gaze fixed on the crumbling shards. More tiny spikes and spurs of bone burst out of them and shriveled stillborn. Another burst as Harrow curled her fist into a ball. Then nothing. There was no more bone left. Dulcinea breathed in admiration. "It's awful quick," then said the adept of the House of the Ninth. "It is, and I don't see this lightly. Impossible. This is the most efficient death trap I've ever seen. The senescence decays anything before it can cross, and the entropy field, God knows how it's holding, disperses any magical attempt to control the rate of decay. But why hasn't the whole room collapsed? The walls should be so much dust. The field and the flooring are a few micrometers apart. Maybe the Ninth could make a very, very weeny construct to go through that gap," said the Seventh hopefully. Harrow said in bottom of the ocean tones, "The Ninth House has not practiced its art on weeny constructs before you ask." "It's not a lateral puzzle either," said Dulcinea. "You can't go through the floor because it's solid steel. You can't go through the ceiling because that's also solid steel. And there's no other access, and Palamity Sextus estimated you could walk for probably 3 seconds. Before you died, Hera got very focused very suddenly. Sextus has seen this. I asked him first, said Dulcinea. And when I told him the method, he said he'd never do it. I thought that was fascinating. I'd love to get to know him better. That got every particle of Herohark known at Gesimus's attention. Dulcinea absently tossed her crutches to Protosleus one by one, and he caught them out of the air as though he didn't even have to think about it, which Gideon had to admit was cool. She sat down heavily on the stairs quite close to her, and she said there is one way of doing it, and he wouldn't. I'm sorry that I didn't admit it, but you were my second choice. If black vessels won't cross this line, I don't think anyone will, and I can't because I physically can't walk the whole way unassisted. If I faint or go funny halfway there, it will mean my timely death. And what is it, said Hero in a voice that meant trouble, that even Palamity Sextus won't do. He won't siphon, said Dulcinea. The shutters on Harry's face were pulled shut. And nor will I, she said. I don't mean so. Siphoning, not quite. When Master Octachazoron siphons his cavalier, he sends the soul elsewhere, and then exploits the space it leaves behind. The power that rushes in to fill that space will keep refilling for as long as either of them can survive. You wouldn't have to send anyone anywhere, but the entropy field will drain your own reserves of Thanergy as soon as you cross the line, so you need to draw on a power source on this side of the line where the field can't touch it. Do you understand? Don't patronize me, Lady Septimus. Of course I understand. Understanding a problem is nowhere near the same as implementing a solution. You should have asked Octokaiserin and his human vein. I probably would have, said Dulcinea candidly, if Pro hadn't blacked his eye for him so technically, said Hero. Acid as a battery were your third choice. Well, Abigail Pent was a very talented spirit magician, such Dulcinea, and relented when she saw her as expression. I'm sorry, I'm teasing. No, I don't think I would have asked. The 8th house, Reverend daughter. There is something cold and white and inflexible about the 8th. They could have done this with ease. Maybe that's why. And now Abigail Pent is dead. What am I to do? If you were to ask Sex just for me, do you think he'd do it? You seem to know him better than me. Pharaoh pushed herself up from the stairs. She had not seemed to notice that Dulcinea was leaning with her flower-like face in her hands and drinking in her every movement, nor her expression of carefully studied innocence. Gideon was undergoing complicated feelings about not being the center of the 7th attention. With a flourish of inky skirts, Harold Hark turned back to the stairs, staring through Dulcinea rather than at her. Let's say I agree with your theory, she said. To maintain enough energy for my wards inside the field, I'd need to fix a siphon point outside it. The most reasonable source of energy would be you. You can't move Thanergy from place to place like that, said the 7th with very careful gentleness. It has to be life to death or death to a sort of life. Like the second two, you'd have to take mythology. She raised a wasted hand and then let it flutter back to her face like a drifting paper plane. Me, I could get you maybe 10 meters. We adjourn, said Harrow Hark. Harrow grasped Gideon hard around the arm and practically dragged her back up the stairs, out past the foyer and into the hallway. The noise of the door slamming behind them echoed around the corridor. Gideon found herself staring straight down the barrel of a loaded Harrow Harkanona. Jazumus, who'd shaken back to reveal blazing black eyes in a painted white face of Volscian. She said bitterly, of course, Nev, I'm going to bed down hard on your trust again. Why are you so into this? Asked Gideon. I know you're not doing it for Dulcinea. Let me make my business plain. I have no interest in Septimus's woes. Hera said, the 7th house is not our friend. You're making yourself an utter fool over Dulcinea, and I dislike her cavalier even more. Massive slam on Pridus Alauus out of nowhere, said Gideon. But I would finish the challenge that sickens Sextus, not for the high ground, but because he must learn to stir these things in the face. Do you know what I'd have to do? Yeah, said Gideon. You're going to suck out my life energy in order to get to the box on the other side. A hand-fisted summary. But yes, how did you come to that conclusion? Because it's something Palamides wouldn't do, she said. And he's a perfect moron over Camilla the 6th. Okay, what do you mean okay? I mean okay, I'll do it, said Gideon, although most of her brain was trying to give the part of her brain saying that a nipple gripple. She chewed at a damp fleck of lip paint and took off her dark glasses and popped them into her pocket. Now she could look her dead in the eye. I'd rather be your battery than feel you rummaging around in my head. You want my juice? I'll give you juice under no circumstances will I ever desire your juice, said her necromancer, mouth getting more desperate. Nev, you don't know precisely what this is asking. I will be draining you dry in order to get to the other side. If at any point you throw me off, if you fail to submit, I die. I have never done this before. The process will be imperfect. You will be in pain. How do you know? Harrow Hark said the second house is famed for something similar in reverse. The second necromancer's gift is to drain her dying foes to strengthen and augment her cavalier. Rad, it said they all die screaming, said Harrow. Nice to know that the other houses are also creeps, said Gideon. Nerve, she said, I'll still do it. Her heart chewed on the insides of her cheeks so hard that they looked close to staving, and she stapled her fingers together, squeezed her eyelids shut. When she spoke again, she made her voice quite calm and normal. Why? Probably because you asked. The heavy eyelids shutted open, revealing baleful black irises. That's all it takes, Griddle. That's all you demand. This is the complex mystery that lies in the pit of your psyche. Gideon slid her glasses back onto her face, obscuring feelings. With tense, she found herself saying, that's all I ever demanded. And to maintain face, Suffix did with U.S. wipe. When they returned, Dulcinea was still sitting on the stairs and talking very quietly to her big cavalier, who had dropped to his haunches and was listening to her as silently as a microphone might listen to its speaker. When she saw that the ninth house pair were back in the room, she staggered to rise. Princess Lois rose, with her silently offering her an arm of support, as Hera Hark said, we'll make our attempt. You could practice if you wanted, said Dulcinea. This won't be easy for you. I wonder why you made that assumption, said Harold Hark. Dulcinea dimpled. I oughtn't to horse eye, she said. Well, I can at least look after Gideon the ninth while you're over there. Gideon still saw no reason why she would need looking after. She stood in front of the stairs, feeling like a useless appendage and gripping the hilt of her sword, as though through sheer effort she could still use it. It seemed dumb to be a cavalier primary with no more use than a big battery. Her necromancer stood in front of her, with much the same non-placidness, hands working over each other as though wondering what to do with them, and she swept one gloved hand over the side of Gideon's neck, fingers resting on her pulse, and breathed an impatient breath. It felt like nothing at first besides Harrow touching her neck, which was a one-way trip to No Town. But it was just Harrow touching her neck. She felt the blood pump through the artery. She felt herself swallow, and that swallow go down past the flat of Harrow's hand. Maybe there was a little twinge of shadow around the skull, a tactual twitch, but it was not the pressure and the jolt she remembered from response and imaging her adept took a step back, thoughtful fingers curling in and out of her palms. Then she turned and plunged through the barrier. And there was the jolt. It started in Gideon's jaw, starbursts of pain rattling all the way from mandible to molars, electricity blasting over her scalp. She was Hera walking into no man's land. She was Gideon's skull jottering behind the line. She sat down on the stairs very abruptly and did not pay attention to Dulcinea reaching out for her before drawing back. It was like Hera had tied a rope to all her pain receptors and was repelling down a very long drop. She dimly watched her necromancer take step after painstakingly slow step across the empty metal expanse. There was a strange fogging around her. It took Gideon a moment to realize that the spell was eating through Harrow's black robes of office, grinding them into dust around her body. Another lightning flash went through her head. Her immediate instinct was to reject it, to push against awareness of Hero. The sense of crushing pressure, the blood transfusion feel of loss, bright lights danced in her vision. She fell to the side and became disjointedly aware of Dulcinea, her head on Dulcinea's thin thigh, the glasses slipping off her nose and rattling down onto the next step. She watched her walk, as though against the wind, blurred with particles of black. Then she found herself snorting out big hideous fountains of blood. Her vision blurred again grayly, and her breath stuttered in her throat. No. Such Dulcinea, oh no, 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 stay awake. Gideon couldn't say anything, but mainly because blood was coming enthusiastically out of every hole in her face. Then all of a sudden it wasn't drying up, parching, leaving her with a waterless and arid tongue. The pain moved down to her heart and massaged it, electrifying her left arm and her left fingers, her left leg and her left toes. It was beyond pain. It was as though her insides were being sucked out through a gigantic straw in her dimming vision. She saw Harold Hark walking away, no longer haloed by fragments, but limned with a great yellow light that flickered and ate at her heels, and her shoulders. Tears filled Gideon's eyes unbidden, and then they gummed away at all, blurred gray and gold. Then just gray. Oh Gideon, someone was saying, you poor baby. The pain went down her right leg and to her right toes, and then up her spine and zigzags. She dry heaved. There was still that pressure, the pressure of Hero, and the sense that if she pushed at it, if she just went and fucking knocked at it, it would go away. She was solely tempted. Gideon was in the type of pain where consciousness disappeared, and only the animal remained, bucking, yelping, an idiot yelp, butting and bleeding. Throw her heart off or slip into sleep, anything for release. If there had been any sense that she had to try to hold the connection, she would have lost it already. Gideon was just overwhelmed with how badly she wanted to shove against it, not huddle in a corner and scream. Was she screaming? Oh shit, she was screaming. It's all right, someone was saying over the noise. You are all right, Gideon. Gideon, you're so young. Don't give yourself away. Do you know it's not worth it? None of this is worth it at all. It's cruel. It's so cruel. You are so young and vital and alive. Gideon, you're all right. Remember this, and don't let anyone do it to you ever again. I'm sorry we take so much. I'm so sorry. She would remember each word later, loud and clear. Her forehead and face were being mocked. Touch did not register. She had lost control of her limbs, and each was flailing independently of the others, a ruling mass of nerves and panic. Her hair was being stroked softly, and she did not want to be touched, but she was terribly afraid that if it stopped, she would roll away into the field and dissolve just to get away. She held on to the sound of talking so that she didn't go mad. She's all the way across, said the voice. She's made it to the books. Can you see the trick of it, Reverend daughter? There's a trick, isn't there, Gideon? I'm going to put my hand over your mouth. She needs to think. A hand went over her mouth and Gideon bit it. Oh, you fell. There she goes. Perhaps they thought that if it was easy to obtain, someone could finish the demonstration some other way. It's got to be foolproof. Gideon, I know that. I wish it were me. I wish I were up there. She's got the box open. I wonder. Yes, she's worked it out. I was afraid she'd break the key clutched in the thin lap. Gideon could make no response that was not retching, gurgling, or clamoring, silenced only by one rather skinny hand. Good girl, the voice was saying. Oh, good girl, she's got it, Gideon. And I've got you, Gideon of the golden eyes. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. I'm so sorry. Stay with me, the voice said more urgently. Stay with me. Gideon was suddenly aware that she was very cold. Something had changed. It was getting harder to suck in each breath. She stumbled, said. The voice detached, and Gideon heaved not against the connection, but into it. The consequent pain was so intense that she was afraid she might wet herself. But the spike of cold faded. She's up, Gideon. Gideon, she's up just a little bit more, darling. You're fine. Poor baby. Now Gideon was scared. Her body had the soft, drunken feeling you got just before fainting away. And it was very hard to stay conscious 3 seconds before you die. Calamides had calculated anything less than her crossing the threshold would make the struggle meaningless. The hand touched her face, her mouth, her eyebrows, smooth her temples. As if knowing her thoughts by her face, the voice whispered, don't. It's very easy to die, Gideon the ninth. You just let it happen. It's so much worse when it doesn't. But come on, chicken, not right now. And not yet. It felt like all the pressure in her ears was popping loose. The voice said, musical and distant, Gideon, you magnificent creature, keep going. Feed it to her. She's nearly made it, Gideon. Gideon, eyes open. Stay put. Stay with me. It took an infinity amount of seconds for her to stay put, for her to crack her eyes open. When her eyes opened, Gideon was distantly worried to discover that she was blind. Colors swam in front of her vision in a melange of muted hues. Something black moved. It took her a moment to realize that it was moving very quickly. It was sprinting mildly. Startled, Gideon realized that she was starting to die. The colors wobbled before her face. The world revolved, then revolved the other way, aimlessly spinning. The air stopped coming. It would have been peaceful, only it sucked. A new voice said, Gideon. Gideon. When she opened her eyes again, there was a dazzling moment of clarity and sharpness. Hero Nona Yazimus was kneeling by her side, naked. As the day she was spawned, her hair was shown a full inch shorter. The tips of her eyelashes were gone, and most horrifyingly, she was absolutely nude of face paint. It was as though someone had taken a hot washcloth to her without paint. She was a point-chined, narrow-jawed, ferrety person with high, hard cheekbones and a tall forehead. There was a little divot in her top lip at the philtrum, which gave a bow-like aspect to her otherwise hard and fearless mouth. The world rocked, but it was mainly because Haru was shaking her shoulders. "Haha," said Gideon. "First time you didn't call me Griddle and died well passed out, but it felt a hell of a lot like dying. Waking up had an air of resurrection, of having spent a winter as a dried-out shell and coming back to the world as a new green shoot with problems." Her whole body felt like one traumatized nerve. She was lying within the cradle of thin and wasted arms. She looked up into the soft and weary face of Dulcinea, whose eyes were still the dusty blue of blueberries. When she saw that Gideon was awake, she sparkled to life. "You big baby," she said, and shamelessly kissed her on the forehead her heart was sitting on. The cold ground opposite. She was wrapped in chilly dignity, and Gideon's overcloak, even the bone studs in her ears had disappeared, leaving little pock marks where they ought to have been. "Lady Septimus," she said, "unhand my cavalier nerve. Are you able to stand, oh reverend daughter?" "No, give her a minute," Dulcinea begged. "Pro, help her, don't let her stand alone. I do not want you or your cavalier to touch her," said Harry. Gideon wanted to say Nona Yazamus quit the sacred bat black vessel act, but found she couldn't say anything. Her mouth felt like a dried-out sponge. Her adept rummaged around in her overcloak pockets and emerged with a few bone chips, which gave rise to the horrible idea that she had stashed them there again. "Unhand her." Dulcinea ignored her totally. "You were incredible," she told Gideon. "Astonishing, Lady Septimus," the other necromancer repeated. "I will not ask thrice." Gideon could not manage anything better than a very feeble thumbs up in Dulcinea's direction. Dulcinea unwound herself, which was a shame. She was warm, and the room was colder than 10 witches' tits. She reached out one last time to skim a hand over Gideon's forehead. She whispered, "Archly nice." Harrow said Septimus. Dulcinea scooted herself back to the stairs. Gideon watched with dim interest as Harrow cracked her knuckles and sucked in a breath. Nothing loose. Her necromancer leant down and heaved one of Gideon's arms around her skinny shoulders before Gideon could even think. Oh shit, she had been pulled to stand as Harrow Hark's knees buckled beneath her. There was a bad moment when she wanted to puke, a good moment when she didn't, and a bad moments again when she realized that she only hadn't because she couldn't. The Lady of the Seventh was saying, "Reverend's daughter, I'm terribly grateful for what you just did. I'm sorry for the cost. Don't. It was a business decision. You'll get your key when I'm done. But Gideon is not your business." Dulcino's hands came to rest in her lap, and she tilted her head. "I see," she said, smiling, and somewhat crestfallen. "A barefoot." Hera grunted under her breath as she continued to try to haul Gideon up the short flight of stairs, panting for breath. By the top step, Gideon could only watch, willing herself to come to full consciousness, astonished by the unreceptivity of her body. It was all she could do to not deliquesce out of Harrow's grip. At the top of the stairs they stopped, and the reverend daughter looked back searchingly. She said abruptly, "Why did you want to be a lector?" Gideon mumbled. "Harrow, you can't just ask someone why they want to be a lector," but was wrongly ignored. The older woman was leaning against Professor Lois's arm. She looked extraordinarily sad, even regretful. When she caught Gideon's eye, a tiny smile tugged on the corners of her mouth, then drooped again. Eventually she said, "I didn't want to die." Walking back through the chilly foyer to the corridor was bad. Gideon had to break away from Harrow and rest her cheek on the cold metal paneling next to the door. Her necromancer waited with uncharacteristic patience for her to regain some semblance of consciousness, and they stumbled onward, Gideon drunk and Hero flinching her bare feet away from the grill. "You didn't have to be a dick," she found herself saying thickly. "I like her." "I don't like her," said Hera. "Ho, I don't like her, Cavalier. I still don't get why you're all up in arms against what is a very basic man, Hulk. Did you get the key?" The key appeared in Harrow's other hand, shining silvery white, austerely plain, with a single loop for a head and 3 simple teeth on the shaft. "Nice," said Gideon. She rummaged in an inner pocket and removed the ring. The key slid next to the hatch key and read "response key" with an untidy musical tinkle. Then she said, "Sorry, your clothes melted." "No," said Harrow, with the slow deliberation of someone close to screaming. "Stay quiet. You're not entirely well. I underestimated how long it would take me." The field was vicious, much more so than Septimus communicated. It had started to strip the moisture from my eyeballs before I refined on the fly by which point it had eaten your underwear, said Gideon. "Nav, I just had a near-death experience. She said, "Let me have my little moment." How they got all the way up the ladder, Gideon later had no idea. It was with strange dreamlike precision that Herahark bullied and boasted her down the long winding halls of Canaan House and back to the quarters that the ninth house occupied, without a flicker of magic. Hero wearing nothing but a big black overcloak. Every so often she wondered if she had in fact kicked the bucket, and this was her afterlife, wandering empty halls with a half-naked, chastened Herahark Nanajazimas, who had no recalls, but to be gentle with her, handling her as though at any moment she would explode into wet confetti giblets. She even let her steer her toward the blankets that constituted her bed. Gideon was too exhausted to do anything but lie down and sneeze 3 times in quick succession, each sneeze a migraine gong through sinus and skullbone. "Quit looking at me like that," she eventually commanded her, wiping bloody muck onto her hanky. "I'm alive, you nearly weren't," said Harris soberly, "and you're not even agreed about it. Don't price your life so cheaply, Griddle. I have absolutely no interest in you losing your sense of self-preservation. What are these theorems?" For she suddenly exploded. "What did we gain from that? What was the point? I should have walked away like Sextus. But I don't have the luxury. I need to become liquor now." Before she bit off her words like meat from a bone, Gideon waited to know before what. But no more was forthcoming. She closed her eyes and waited, but opened them when she panicked and realized that she had forgotten how long it had been since she had shot them. Herahark was sitting there with that same curious expression on her paintless face, looking thoroughly unlike herself. "Get some rest," she said imperiously for the first time. Gideon obeyed her without conjunction. Chapter 21. When Gideon woke up later, Dominicus had made the room wet and orange with evening light. She was cramped from hunger. When she rolled over, she was assaulted with a series of increasingly aggressive notes. "Have taken the keys and gone to examine the new laboratory. Do not come and find me." This was plainly unfair. Even if the delights locked behind a literal door could only really be enjoyed by someone who gurgled over necromantic theorems. "But anyway, do not leave the quarters. I will ask Sexters to look at you. Willingly go to Calamities." Hera must have had a hell of a fright. Gideon reflexively checked her pulse in case she was still dead. "Do not go anywhere. I have left some bread for you in a drawer." Go anywhere in this case is defined as leaving the quarters to go to any other location in Canaan House, which you are banned from doing. "I'm not eating your nasty drawer food," said Gideon, and rolled out of bed. She felt terrible, like she hadn't slept for days and days, then remembered that she hadn't really accepting last night. She felt feeble as a kitten. It took all her strength just to get to the bathroom, wash her scabriously painted face, and lap at the tap like an animal. The mirror reflected a haggard girl whose blood probably resembled fruit juice, with anemia all the way up to her ears. She combed through her hair with her fingers and thought of Dulcinea, and for some reason blushed deeply. The water was fortifying the bread in the drawer, which she ate ravenously like a race was not. Gideon searched around in her pockets, just in case she had left something there, an apple or some nuts, and found herself startled when she found the note, and then wondered why she was startled. Her memory caught up a lagged step behind her comprehension. The piece of flimsy was still there, though the piece of flimsy had been there all the time, so there was a horrible possibility inherent. There was a knock on the door. Nonplussed, unpainted, and hungry, she opened it. Nonplussed, much tried, and impatient, Camilla the sixth stared back. She sighed, obviously tired of Gideon's bullshit already, and raised a hand with 3 digits bent. "How many fingers?" she demanded. Gideon blinked. "How many bent? Or how many you're showing? And do I count the thumb? Vision's fine," said Camilla to herself, and retracted the hand she elbowed into the room as though she had license, and that a heavy bag dropped to the floor with a thud. Kneeling down to riffle through it. "Language is fine. Where are we? What do we come here for? What's your name?" "What's your mom's name?" said Gideon. "Why are you here?" The compact gray-clad cave of the sixth did not even look up at this question. It was interesting to see her in the light. Her fine sheets of slate-brown hair were cut sharply below her chin, giving a general air of scissor blades. She glanced up at Gideon without seeming very perturbed. "Your necromancer talked to my necromancer," she said. "My necromancer said you should be a corpse. You breathing, yes, passing blood in your piss. Look, this conversation is all I've ever dreamed about," said Gideon. "But I'm fine. My necromancer overreacted. This at least seemed to strike a chord with Camilla, whose glance softened with the understanding of someone whose necromancer was also prone to gross overreaction. I'm just hungry. Do I, or do I not seem totally fine to you? You do, said Camilla, who had pulled a frankly upsetting bulbous glass object out of her bag. That's what I'm worried about. Warden said you'd be in a coma. Put this in the bulb. Thankfully went in the mouth, another one tucked up into her armpit. Gideon submitted to this treatment because she had gone around with Camilla the Sixth before and had a healthy fear of her. The other cavalier looked at her toes and fingertips and inside her ears, whatever she found, plus her pulse, which the other cavalier took carefully, was noted down in a fat notebook with a stub of lead pencil. These numbers were scanned with due diligence. And then Camilla shook her head. You're fine, she said. Shouldn't be, but you're fine, Gideon said bluntly. Why didn't Sextus want to do the spell? The tools were wiped and put back in the bag. For a moment the other cavalier didn't answer. Then she pushed a strand of hair away from her grim oval painting of her face and said, Warden did the calculations. He and I could have completed it, but with caveats, like my permanent brain damage, said Camilla shortly, if he didn't get it right immediately. But I'm healthy. Didn't say your brain was. I'm taking that as a very witty joke and want it to be known that I laughed, said Gideon. Hey, Septimus said the Eighth could have done it easily. The Eighth doesn't train cavaliers, said Camilla, even more shortly than before. The Eighth breeds batteries, genetic match for the necromancer. He's been accessing his cavalier since he was a child. The Eighth probably does have brain damage. Is not his brain. They need a lady. Septimus is too willing to believe in fairy stories. Same as always. This was probably the longest speech she had ever heard Camilla give, and Gideon was deeply interested. Are you two friends? The look in response wasn't quite withering, but it would suck all the moisture out of anyone. It was aimed at Camilla, said Lady Septimus, and I have never met. Look, you should eat this. Turned out to be an invitation. Camilla, obviously used to being someone's cavalval work, helped her sling on her rapier and waited as she applied a very cursory amount of face paint. She wouldn't have passed muster with a glaucomic nun in a room with the light shot out, but it was enough to get on with. She didn't quite have to lean on Camilla's arm, but every so often was the recipient of a brisk shoulder press to get her standing straight. They kept mutual and pleasant silence, and the sunset bled through all the windows and gaps of the house of the first and made puddles of red and orange before them. Every so often a white belted skeleton crossed their path with an easy arm swinging gait. Each time a bony figure appeared from a corner, all clattered through a doorway. Gideon noticed Camilla's fingers close on her rapier out of pure reflex. When they stopped at the threshold of the dining hall, the cavalier of the Sixth was poised like a waiting shrike. There were voices within. Princess Ianthe has won. It's not at all the same thing, someone was saying. A tall and golden figure was standing before the tables, her saffron hair unbrushed and sleep in her eyes. Her clothes looked as though she had slept in them. Corona bath was still magnificent. She was talking to Teacher, who was sitting at one of the long polished tables. There was Palamides next to him with an uneaten meal and a piece of paper scribbled almost 2 holes, and some of the sizzling tautness surrounding Camilla went off the boil. Her shoulders relaxed. Just a fragment. Teacher said gently, that is also not correct. The owner is Nuberius III. If it is being held for him by Princess Ianthe, it's still his one key for the third house, and one only. I am afraid then the 5th key should be given to me. Magnus wouldn't have minded. Magnus V had asked for his own facility key, and I do not know where it is, said Teacher, scolded by the bright orange light of the setting sun coming down through the great ceiling windows. Corona looks like a grief-stricken king. Her lovely chin and shoulders were thrust out defiantly, and her mouth was hard and remorseless as glass. Her violet eyes looked as though she had been crying, though perhaps from anger. Palamides' chair clattered as he rose, saying courteously to this vision, Princess, if you wish it, I'll escort you down to the facility right now. Gideon corked Camilla's low the hell you. More chairs scraped on the tiled floor. Gideon hadn't noticed the duo from the second house at the table farthest away, drinking hot coffee and looking as they ever did, as though they had just trimly stepped from the pages of a military magazine. Captain Dutour said, I am surprised that the warden of the 6th house would break compact like this. You've said yourself that this can't be solved communally. And I was right, Captain, said Calamities, for this is harmless. Corona Beth had crossed the floor to Calamities, and though he was tall, she towered a full half a head over him if you included the hair. Camilla had edged around the room to stand half a step behind her necromancer, Gideon sloping helplessly behind. But war was not on the third's mind. Corona was not smiling, but her mouth was fine and frank and eager, and she rested her hand on his shoulder. Do this for me, she said, and the third house will owe the sixth house a favor. Help me get the same keys as my sister, and the third house will go down on its knees for the sixth house. Captain Dushara said. Isolate, harmless princess, said Calamities, who had to blink his extremely lambent gray eyes under this assault. I can't. What you're asking is impossible. I mean it. Wealth, military prizes, research materials, she said, and turned on, encroaching into Calamities' personal space. Gideon was in awe of the six at this point, as under the same treatment she would have breathed so hard that she fainted. The third thanks will be as gracious as you need them to be, Corona. This is rank bribery. The second won't stand for it, and the sixth is too wise to buy into it. Oh, shut up, Judith, she said. Your house would give bribes in a heartbeat if you had any money. Judith said slowly. You insult the second. Don't toss the gauntlet at me, said Corona. Novarius would just treat it as an early birthday present. Six, believe me, I'm good for it. It's not that I don't want what you're offering, is that you're asking for the impossible, said Calamities, with a touch more impatience in his voice. You can't get the keys your sister has. Each key is unique. Frankly, there are only one or two left in all Canaan House that haven't been claimed already. The room fell silent. The seconds' carefully placid faces were frozen. Corona had gone still. Gideon's own face must have been doing something, because the rangy necromancer of the sixth looked at her, and then looked at the second, and said, you must have realized this. Gideon wondered why she hadn't realized this. She wondered why she had assumed that maybe there were infinity keys, or enough for a full set each. She sat down hard on the closest chair at the closest table, counting the keys mentally, the red and white keys, that she and Harrow had won the second of them. Huffed Dulcineers by right. At another look at everyone's faces, Palamides said more irascibly, you must have realized this. The golden hand had not dropped from his shoulder, but instead fisted in his shirt. But that means the challenge must be communal, said Corona, with an exquisite furrow of her brow. If we're all only given pieces of this puzzle, refusing to share the knowledge means that nobody can solve it. We need to pull everything, or none of us will ever be liquor. There has to be. It hasn't it. Teacher had sat with his hands around his cup of tea, as though enjoying the heat, breathing in its curls of fragrant steam. There is no law, he said, against teaming up. No, said Teacher. What I mean is there is no law. You could join forces. You could tell each other anything. You could tell each other nothing. You could hold all keys and knowledge in common. I have given you your rule, and there are no others. Some things may take you swiftly down the road to liquor. Some things may make the row harder to plow. We still come under imperial law, said Martyr. The second, all of us come under the sway of imperial law, agreed her necromancer, whose expression was now a shade doubtful. Rules exist, like I've said, before the first house falls under cohort jurisdiction. Where you got that idea from, said Teacher tartly. And it was the first time Gideon had heard him give even a little reproof. I do not know. We are in a sacred space. Imperial law is based on the writ of the Emperor, and here the Emperor is the only law. No writ, no interpretation. I gave you his rule. There is no other but natural law. The laws against murder and theft. What prevents us from stealing one another's keys through intimidation, blackmail, law, deception? What would stop someone from waiting for another necromancer and their cavalier to gather a sufficient number of keys, then taking them by force? Teacher said nothing. Corona Beth had finally dropped her hand from Palamides' shoulder. She looked over at the second house. A somber understanding was dawning on Captain Dusears' face, and Lieutenant Diasis was as inscrutable as ever. And then she looked at Calamities, whose expression was that of a soldier who had just heard the call to the front. There was a shields up twist to his mouth and eyes. Corona breathed, the auntie has to know, and fled from the room. Her leaving was a little like an eclipse. The evening sun seemed to cool with her, and the duller electric lights vibrated to life with her passing. In an almost inexcusably banal act, a white-belted skeleton appeared from the kitchen with 2 steaming plates of the poached pale meat and root vegetables. One of these was put in front of Gideon, and she remembered that she was ravenous, she ignored the knife and fork that the skeleton carefully laid at either side of the plate, as nicely as anyone with a soul would have, and started cramming food into her mouth with her hands. Teacher was still bracing, his hands around his cup, his expression more final than troubled to serene to be worried, but still somehow thoughtful. A little woe begone. Teacher, said Calamities, when did Magnus V ask you for a facility key? Why, the night he died, said Teacher. He and little John Marie after the dinner, but she didn't take hers. Magnus asked me to hold on to it for safekeeping. She was not happy. I thought perhaps the fourth would come and ask for it today. Then again, if I could prevent either of those two children from going down to that place, I would. He looked up through the skylight at the deepening dusk, the curls of steam from his mug slowly thinning away. O Emperor of the Nine Houses, he said to the night, Necro Lord, Prime God who became man and man who became God, we have loved you these long days. The 16 gave themselves freely to you, Lord. Let nothing happen that you did not anticipate. There came the noisy clasher of bulls. It was the second two. Instead of sitting back down, were collating their cutlery and pushing in their chairs. They left in taut silence, single file, without a glance back at anyone remaining. Camilla sat down opposite Gideon as the skeleton put the second plate in front of her, and she used her knife and fork, though not with any great elegance. The necromancer of the sixth was rubbing at his temples. His cavalier looked at him, and he offhandedly took a few bites of his meat and his vegetables. Then he stopped pretending and put down his fork. Come, he said. Ninth, when you're finished, come with me. It didn't take long for Gideon to finish, as in any case she hadn't much bothered to chew. She stared with glossy eyes at Camilla, the sixth plate. Camilla, who had finished most of hers, rolled her eyes and pushed her leftovers to Gideon. This was an act for which she was fond of Camilla forever. After then, they both followed a stoop-shouldered Calamities as he pushed through the door that the second had left from down a corridor, and a short flight of steps, turning a wheel on an iron door. Its glass window rhymed thickly with frost. This appeared to be where the priest stored anything perishable. Strings of startled frozen fish, with their scales and tails intact, hung like laundry on lines above steel countertops, bewildering Gideon with the reality of what she had been eating. Other even weirder meats were stacked in alcoves to one side of the room, expiration dates labeled with spidery handwriting. A fan blasted the area with toe-curlingly cold air as Gideon wrapped her cloak more thickly around her. Barrels lined some of the other walls. Fresh vegetables, obviously just picked for tonight's shopping, lay on a granite board. A skeleton was packing linen wrapped wheels of some waxy white substance into a box. A door LED away from this frigid opened, and the second emerged. They did not look happy to see the newcomers. Captain Dutir said heavily, You're a full sextus. I don't deserve that, said Calamities. You're the one who just found nothing for the second time. The sixth house is welcome to succeed where the second has failed. She tugged her already perfect gloves into even glossier, unwrinkled smoothness, and flakes of ice settled on her braided head. The community needs this over and done with, she said. It needs someone who can take command, end this, and send everyone back in one piece. Will you consider working with me? No, said Calamities. I'm not bribing you with goods and services. I'm asking you to choose stability. I can't be bribed with goods and services, said Calamities. But I can't be bribed with moral platitudes either. My conscience doesn't permit me to help anyone do what we have all embarked upon. You don't understand, Calamity said savagely. Captain, God help you when you understand. My only consolation is that you won't be able to put any responsibility on my head. The cohort necromancer closed her eyes and seemed to count slowly to 5. Then she said, I'm not interested in veiled threats or vagaries. Will you answer honestly? If I ask you how many keys you have, I would be a fool to answer, he said. But I can tell you that I have fewer than you think. I am not the only one who came here wanting to be a liquor captain. You've just been too damn slow on the uptake. Lieutenant Diasis' fingers closed slowly and deliberately around the hilt of her functional rapier. Camilla's fingers were already on hers. Her other hand was on the hilt she kept at her left hip, the embossed grip of her dagger. Gideon, who had just eaten 1.25 dinners, felt unbelievably unready for whatever was about to go down. She was relieved when the necromancer of the second said, Leave it, the dyer's cast, and both women pushed past them. Calamides LED the other to Cavaliers through the nondescript door to another nondescript room, past the cooling ladder This room held big shelves at one end stacked one atop the other, a few tables with wheels from which the rubber was peeling off in big strips were parked in a corner. These tables were high and long enough to hold a whole person lying flat. It was the morgue, though a more impersonal and featureless morgue Gideon could not imagine. Gideon said, "How long have you known about the keys?" "Long enough," said Calamities, hooking his fingers underneath the lid of a morgue shelf. "You're known." Jazumus confirmed it with me. "After the fifth were killed." "Yes, I know you've known the whole time." "Oh, exquisite." Her hawk had kept Calamity Sextus in a loop that didn't include Gideon. She felt angry, then she felt bereft, then she felt angry again. This felt like being hot and cold at once, totally heatless offer. The sixth necromancer continued, "I meant what I said, though there are precious few keys left. The feces hits the fans starting now." "Cam, did you bring the box?" Gideon said. "What do you mean?" Camilla had dropped her heavy bag next to her necromancer, and he was riffling through it with one hand, pulling the shelf out with the other. Well-greased struts smoothly produced a body covered with a thin white sheet, murmuring, "Interview, feet first." Palamides pulled the sheet up from the feet all the way to the abdomen and started carefully feeling the legs through the clothes. It was madness, and he had not improved since Gideon had last seen him. She regretted again eating 1.25 dinners. "Put it this way," he said, eventually palpating a hip. "Up till now I'd assumed everyone was being remarkably civil. If the initial method of obtaining keys was cleverness and hard work, the way forward from here will be either what you just saw, heavy-handed alliance attempts, or worse." "Why do you think the eighth picked a fight with the seventh?" "Because she's a prick and a nasty weirdo," said Gideon. "Intriguingly put," said Calamities. "But although he is a prick and a nasty weirdo, Dulcinea Septimus has to keys. Silas has made her a target." This was all getting unreal, a weird mathematics that she hadn't even been counting. But she was still 90 enough to hold her tongue. She said instead, "No offense, but what the hell are you doing?" He had taken a finger full of jelly out of a little tub Camilla had profit. He was rubbing it over. Bizarrely enough, the dull gold hoop of Magnus Quinn's wedding ring with a stick of grease he made to marks above and below the band of metal, and then held his hand over it like someone cupping a flame. Calamides closed his eyes, and after a pregnant pause, steam began to curl above his knuckles. All at once he muttered, crossed it to himself, and took his hand away. This time the grease went beneath the ring, and he started to ease it off the sad dead finger. "I need more contact," he said to his cavalier. "This touched the key ring, but there's too much jumble. And to Gideon, our reputation doesn't precede us. I see Thanarji attaches to more than just the body." Ninth psychometry contractor Thanarji lingering in objects when you get to it early, and when there's a strong association. "Give me the scissors. I'm going to take some of his pockets." What you Queen's key ring?" Ninth said Calamities, as though her question was really hopelessly obvious. "There was nothing on the bodies yesterday. The second came to look, but they haven't got my resources that, or they took the evidence," said his cavalier gloomily. "But her adept counted nor their style anyway. If I couldn't find anything after yesterday's examination, they wouldn't." "Don't get cocky, Warden." "I won't, but I'm fairly sure here," Gideon said. "But hold up, Magnus had only just picked up his facility key the night you know he hadn't reached any challenge labs. The facility key was all he had. Who'd take that?" "That's precisely what I want to know," said Calamities. He dropped the wedding ring into a small bleached pouch that Camilla was holding open, and then took a tiny pair of scissors and started clipping at the dead man's trousers. "Your vow of silence is conveniently variable." "Knight, I'm very grateful. Turns out I'm variably penitent." "Hey, you should be talking to Nona Gesimus." "If I wanted to talk to Nona Yazemis, I'd talk to Nona Yazemis," he said, "or I'd talk to a brick wall. Because honestly, your necromancer is a walking ninth house cliché. You're at least only half as bad." Calamities glanced up Peta. His eyes really were extraordinary, like cut gray rock or deep weather atmosphere. He cleared his throat, and he said, "How much would you do for the Lady Septimus?" Gideon was glad of the pain. She was thrown off balance, unsure of her footing. She said, "Oh, she's been kind to me." "What's your interest in Lady Septimus?" "She's been kind to me," said Calamities. They stared at each other with a kind of commingled weariness and embarrassed suspicion skirting around something juvenile and terrible. "The eighth is both determined and dangerous. Patez allows the seventh is uncomfortably hench, though she's not alone." Camilla spoke up. The man said, glorified orderly, his hands never on his rapier. "First instincts to punch, and he moves like a sleepwalker. Just bear witness, said Palamedes. Just keep her in mind. The scissors went snip snip, and tiny squares of fabric were added to a new linen bag with more reverence than she'd given him credit for. He had just given a corpse an invasive massage and stolen its jewelry. Calamides softly pulled the sheet back over the abdomen and legs of Magnus V. He said quite gently, "We'll get to the bottom of this one if you give us a little time." And Gideon realized he was speaking to the body. Gideon suddenly ached to hear one of the fifth terrible jokes, if only because it would be a refreshing trip back to the status quo. She had to leave. Her hand was on the door, but something in her made her look back and say, "What happened to them? Sex? Just violent head and body trauma," he said. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, and then he turned his laser-sharp gaze on her. "What I do know is it wasn't just a fool." His cavalier said lowly, warningly. Warden for Goody, silence. Now he said to her, and then to Gideon, "Their wounds contained extraordinarily tiny bone fragments. The fragments weren't homogeneous. They were samples from many different osseous sources," which is indicative of what it was indicative of. Was interrupted by a small sound from beyond the door. The noise of skeletons packing things away had disappeared a long time ago. This was the noise of the door wheel being quietly spun. Gideon threw open the door to the cooling room, which Camilla burst into with her sidearm drawn. A hemline was escaping through the wheel-operated portal to the cooler, which had been left open in haste. Gideon and Palamedes stood watching the door creak for lonely in the cold air. The hemline had been blue embroidery, and the pattering feet around the size of a crappy teen's. "Poor dumb kids," Gideon said. "All of for years their elder." "Do you think so?" said Calamity, surprising her. I often find myself wondering how dangerous they really are." Chapter 22. That evening Harrow Hark had still not returned. Gideon busied herself with catching up on her training exercises, frustrated by her sore muscles, which wanted to pack it in. After the first 100 push-ups, she spent a long time doing her solo drills, the automatic litany of grip and guard flexing into hand positions, while staring out the window into the drooping black night, and then pretty certain that Harrow wasn't returning, she got out her long sword and did it all again. Having the hands on the grip was precisely the thing that Iglaman had told her not to do, but it felt so good that by the end she was happy as a child. Her own never came back. Gideon was used to this by now. Seized with sudden experimental courage, she filled up the uncanny tub in the bathroom from the hot liquid tap. When nothing jumped out at her, Gideon sat there in it with water all the way up to her chin. It was incredible, the strangest thing she had ever felt in her life, like being boiled on a warm current, like being slowly boiled, and she worried irrationally whether water could get inside you and make you sick. All her paint came off and floated in long dirty flecks in the water. When she put soap in the water, oily rainbow slick shone across the top. In the end, suspicious of how clean it really got you, she went and stood in the Sonic for 20 seconds. But she smelled incredible when her hair dried. Is stood up on end, and it took a lot of effort to get it flat again. The bath was so horrific. For the first time since she'd come to Canaan House, Gideon was truly content to lie down in her nest, get out a magazine, and do absolutely nothing for half an hour. 9 dreamless hours later, she woke up with the pages stuck to her face by a thin sealant of drool. She said, peeling it off her face. And Harrow, as it turned out, in the next room. Harrow was curled up in bed with the pillows over her head, and her arms sticking out. Haphazardly flung laundry was piled next to the wardrobe door. The sight filled Gideon with a sensation that she had to admit was relief. She said, "Wake up, Munch, I want to yell at you about keys." But this imperative did not have the desired effect. "The white key is now with your precious Septimus, as per the agreement," snapped her, then pulled the covers over her head. "Now go away and shrivel. This does not satisfy me." No. Legitimus Harris slithered more deeply underneath the covers, like a bad black snake, and refused to get up. It was hopeless pushing further. This freed Gideon to dress in relative peace and quiet, paint without critique, and leave their courses feeling unusual amounts of peace with the world. She realized she was being followed somewhere down the long sweeping staircase that led to the atrium. A peripheral blur huddled in doorways. Still, when she was still making tiny movements, when she was in motion, the moldering floorboards creaked weightily underfoot. At last, Gideon spun around, her rapier drawn in one long fluid line forward, and her gauntlet already half snapped onto her fingers, and was presented with the wild young face of Isaac. "Stop," he said. "Sean wants you." He looked ghastly. His hands were sooty, the metallic thread on his embroidered robes soiled, and somewhere along the way he'd lost at least 3 earrings previously. He had contrived to brush his hair up in that bleached avian crest on the top of his head. But now, everything was crumpled flat. His mouth and eyes seemed emptied out, and his pupils were dilated with an amount of cortisol that said, "I've been on edge for 3 days." A sweet puppy fat at his cheeks only served to make him a more awful sight. Gideon cocked her head. "Sean wants you," he repeated. "Someone's dead. You've got to come with me for a moment." Gideon hoped that this was a terrifically misplaced cry for attention, but Isaac had already turned away from her, dark eyes like stones. She had no choice but to follow in his wake. Isaac led her down through the dilapidated great hall, and then down the stairs to the vestibule that led through to the sparring room, and he flinched at the sight of every white-belted skeleton that crossed there. Half the tapestry was still securely in place, the door still hidden. He shouldered through the other door. It must have given his elbow a hell of a bang, and pushed into the room where electric lights poured down on what had previously been a filthy, reeking pit. It was now a square of glimmering water. Gideon had seen skeletons unrolling great tracks of rubber hose into the pit room, and even beheld them slowly glurking sea-smelling liquid into the cavity. But the end result was extraordinary. The tiles gleamed with spray as Nuberius III and Coronabeth, both wearing light singlets and trunks, did laps up and down the pool. If she thought the bath was mad, this blew her mind. Gideon had never seen anyone swim before. Both bodies cut through the liquid with efficient practice strokes. She focused on the long golden arms of Corona Tridentarius as she sliced through water, propelling her as she hit the wall and pushed off hard with her feet beyond the glass doors. In the sparring room, Column the Eighth sat on a bench polishing his targe with a soft cloth, while Lieutenant Diash knelt into a perfect lunge over Isaac made a beeline for the water. He stood in front of where the crown princess of Ida was churning her way through the water. She slowed her pace and bobbed up to the edge of the pool, shaking water out of her ears, quizzically. "Hair wet and lead in amber, Princess Corona," he said. "Someone's dead." The lovely face of the Princess of Ida made the exact same expression Gideon's had wanted to, which was what she said. "Sean wants you," he said. Dolly, specifically Nuberius, had finished his length of the pool too, and had struck through the water to come and see them swimming. Shirt was a lot tighter than Corona Best, and his 57 abdominal muscles rippled under it. Importantly, he gave a long and rather obvious stretch, but stopped when he realized nobody was looking. "Was the hold-up?" he said rather pettishly. "He'd better hurry up." Isaac said, "I promised I'd only leave her for 5 minutes. She's with the remains." Isaac slowed down. Corona had vaulted herself out of the water in a flash of warm golden skin and her exceedingly long legs, and Gideon made her first and only devout prayer to the locked tomb of thankfulness and joy. Corona wrapped herself in a white towel, still dripping feverishly. "Who's dead?" Isaac Tetris. "What does this mean?" "It means someone's dead," Isaac said curtly. "If you're not coming, I'm out of here in the next 10 seconds. I'm not leaving John by herself." Corona dashed over to the training room, sticking her dripping head through the door. Her cavalier was wrapping his body and head in his own white towels, sticking wet feet in his shoes. Corona Beth bothered with neither of these. By now she was being followed by Lieutenant Diash, whose only nod to training kid involved undoing the top button of her military jacket, and by the scuffed weariness of Column the Eighth. Close behind this baffled gaggle was led outside to another broad terrace. Though this one had not been built with beauty in mind, they weren't far from the edge of the dock terrace. This place had possibly shared that function. Once there was room for maybe one shuttle, but it was now focused on a huge steel chimney. Metal flue standing up like a flagpole. It was bricked and supported all about with big stone tiles, and there were buckets of old vegetation and filthy cloths. The latter looked as though they'd been used to clean out the pool. They were emerald with verdigris and black where they weren't green. The chimney had a huge metal grate about 2 meters tall where you could shovel in rubbish. This grate was open, and the contents inside was still lightly smoking. Isaac came to rest in front of the incinerator beside Jean-Marie IV. He had looked stallioned and dead, as though what was going on inside him had built up a thick crust like a volcano. Jean-Marie looks like a malfunctioning electric wire. You could practically see the sparks. Her rapier was naked and she was pacing between the incinerator and the edge, every so often whirling around in a fit as though someone might attack her from behind. Gideon was beginning to admire her sheer animal readiness. When she saw the gang of idiots that her necromancer had brought her, she was intensely displeased. "I wanted the ninth and Princess Corona Beth," she said, her voice cracked. Everyone tagged along, said Isaac. "I didn't want to leave you. I didn't want to leave you alone." Careless of her bare feet and her soaking clothes, Corona marched over to the first man-adjusted teen. "So did Isa chatter," she said kindly. "You're fine." It was testament to Corona that the sword was lowered and slid away into the scabbard, though Genre did not take her hand off the pommel. "What happened? What have you found?" the fourth said bitterly. "The body." Everyone clustered around with a piece of old flagstone. John Murray knocked the still smoking grate aside so that they could all peer through down a short shunt, embers still glowing sooty red. There was a heap of ashes. The cavalier of the second picked up an iron poker from beside the incinerator and nudged the pile. The ashes were all soft and even crumbling to a powdery white, the red lumps breaking up under pressure. There was an expectant pause as she stuck the poker into the far corners of the big expanse and then drew it away. "It's just ashes," said Lieutenant Dyes. "A body was burnt in there," said John Marie. Callum the eighth had gotten hold of a warm rake and was using that to pull some of the stuff closer. He stuck his hand into the boiling air and scooped out hot ashes, which showed that he either cared very little for his own pain or had a supremely good poker face. He held them out for inspection. Whatever had burnt down to a sandy gray-white stuff that left grease marks on the eighth yellowed palms. The necromancy teen was saying listlessly, "I can tell fresh human remains, can't you?" Princess Corona hesitated. The second butted in. "What if they were burning bones? One of the servants may have fallen apart. Someone could just go ask," grumbled Callum the eighth, shocking Gideon with an inherently sensible suggestion. "Isaac didn't hear. That's rendered fat and flesh, not rib bone. They didn't. Other fists still. Magnus and Abigail are still where they ought to be," said John Marie fiercely. "In the mortuary. Someone's been killed and burnt up in the incinerator." There were long scratches down her face. She was even smudgier than her counterpart teen, if that was possible, and in that moment she looked feral. Her curls had frizzed up into a dark brown halo, one liberally streaked with blood and something else disreputable, and her eyes were welling up from the accurate smoke. She did not look like a stable witness to anyone, especially not to Nibirius. He crossed his arms, shivered in the morning sun, and drooled. "These are ghost stories, dull. You're both cracking up." "Shut it. I'm not your doll, dickhead." "Princess, tell him those are remains." "Perhaps shut your mouth and fix your hair," said Corona. "Don't discount this." Straight off the bed, as per usual, he looked wounded and scruffed the towel around his damp hair. "Who's discounting?" he said. "I'm not discounting. I'm just saying there's no point, no need for all this fourth house sound and fury. Anyone goes missing, we assume they're having a nap in the incinerator." "You are being," said the second cavalier surprisingly. "Blaze, I hope you end up in the incinerator," said John Marie. "I hope whatever killed Magnus and Abigail and whoever we just found comes after you. I'd love to see your face. Then how will you look when we find you, Prince Nibirius?" Gideon pushed between them before Nibirius could round on the ash street. "Wet-eyed teenager." She stared into the incinerator. The cavalier of the eighth was still poking around, and to her eye she had to admit there was nothing to find. Whatever had been burnt here had been burnt down to greasy, bad-smelling smithereens. Particles of ash floated up from the grate like crumbling confetti, making smuts on their faces. "Needs a bone, magician," said Callum, and dropped the rake. "I'm heading back." Navarius, who had been staring down Genre, was distracted by this. He was more eager and jovial when he said, "You gearing up for your duel with the seventh, the princess? And I'll rough you naturally." "Yes," said the other man without much enthusiasm. "I'll come with. Should be interesting to see the cav. He's not remotely like his rep. Is he? Ain't ever matched him in a tournament myself." At the exit of the third and the eighth cavaliers, the eighth looks like he wished he were deaf. The second went to more silently and wiping her hands on her scarlet neckerchief. Only the teens Gideon and Corona were left. Corona Beth was staring into the steaming ashes, brief singlet and shorts whipping in the wind, fine dry curls of gold escaping from the wet mass of her hair. She looked troubled, which made Gideon sad, but she was also soaked right through to the skin, which made Gideon need a lie down. "I keep seeing things," so the necromantic teen emptily. They turned to look at him out of the corners of my eyes. When it's night time, I keep waking up and hearing something moving or someone standing outside our door. He trailed off. Jean-Marie put her arm around his shoulder and pressed her sweat-straight brown forehead to his, and both sides defeated sizing. Concert. The solace they were taking in each other was the bruising private solace between Necromancer and Cavalier, and Gideon was embarrassed to be audience to it. It was only then that they seemed at all grown up to her. They looked worn down to stubs like ground-down teeth grayed out of their obnoxious vitality and youth. The Cavalier of the fourth house looked up at Gideon and Corona. I wanted you to, because Magnus liked you both, she said, so you get the warning. Don't say I didn't tell you. Then she led Isaac away, him looking like an expectant prey animal, her like dynamite, ushering him back through the salt-warped door. Gideon was left alone with Corona. Beth, the princess, was closing the huge grate to the incinerator and sliding the handle down to lock it. They both beheld it silently. It did seem big enough to heave a person through, down into what one said would have been roaring flames. Clouds passed overhead, plunging what had been dazzling brightness into relative gloom. The clouds were fast and bluish, which Gideon had learned meant that they would soon explode into rain. She could taste it on the air, washing the prickle of smoke off her tongue. When the storm broke, it would break hard. This isn't just fourth house theatrics, said Corona. I don't think they're being reckless here. I think we're actually in trouble, a lot of trouble. In the newfound dimness, Gideon took off her glasses and nodded. Her hood fell back, sliding down in heavy folds of black to her shoulders. The exquisite eyes of the Necromancer of the third were upon her, and the doubtful expression turned into a radiant smile, violet eyes crinkling up at the corners with the hugeness of the grin. Why, Kitty, in the ninth, she exclaimed, morning banished. You're a ginger. The clouds broke later that afternoon. The rain beat at the windows like pellets, and the skeleton servants scurried around with buckets, catching the worst of the sleeting drips, putting matting down for the puddles apparently. Canaan House was so used to this that their response was automatic. Gideon was familiar with rain by now, but the first time she couldn't get over it. The constant pattering drove her mad all night, and she'd had no idea how anyone who lived in atmospheric weather could ever put up with it. Now it was only a murmurous distraction to the noise of the storm. She had gone back to check on Harrow Hark, suddenly paranoid, convinced that she had dreamt up the arms flapping out of the duvet, the short spikes of dark hair visible from under the pillow, that maybe the reverend daughter had made Gideon's youthful dreams come true by spending all night in an incinerator. But Harrow hadn't even woken up. Gideon ate lunch next to a skeleton servant, carefully balancing a bucket on the table into which fat drips fell from the windows, pluing. The numerous dread hadn't really left her since that morning. It was almost a relief to see the shadow of Camilla Hecht fall over her bowl of soup and bread and butter. Camilla's gray hood was wet with rain. Duels off, she said by way of hello. Seventh never turned up, and they're not in their quarters. Let's move. They moved. Gideon's heart hammered in her ears. Her rapier swung against her leg as persistently as the rain peppering the walls of Canaan House. By instinct, Gideon led them through a row of dark, dismal antechambers, door handles slippery with rain, and out into the storm itself, the conservatory where Dulcinea liked to sit. It was stultifyingly hot and muggy in there, but walking into the jaws of a panting animal, rain sleeted off the plex and sky-obscuring sheets. Beyond the conservatory door, under an awning that had long since tipped into the rain, was Dulcinea. She was sprawled across the wet flagstones. Her crutches lay on either side of her, as though they had slipped from her grasp. Gideon's insides into laced lungs, into kidneys, into bowels, then rubber banded back with a twang. It was Camilla who first dropped to her knees beside her and rolled her over on her back. A bruise popped on her temple, and her clothes had soaked right through, as though she had been lying there for hours. There was a terrible bluish tinge to her face. He gave an enormous tearing, terrible cough, pink spittle foaming from her mouth. Her chest jerked. To Carter, it was not a pretty sight, but Gideon welcomed it with open arms. He never came back, she said hopelessly, and fainted. Chapter 23. Perteslas VII was missing. Dulcinea Septis was critically ill, left stranded when her cavalier failed to return, then threatened by the rain. She had tried to walk by herself and slipped. Now she was confined to bed with hot cloths on her chest and no good to anybody. Teacher moved her to one of the tiny rooms in the priest wing, and she had to be laid on her side. so that whatever was choking her lungs could drain out of her mouth and into a basin. Teachers, to nameless colleagues, sat with her replacing the basin and boiling noisy kettles. Everyone else, the second house with their brass buttons, the twins of the third, and their now bouffant cavalier, the fourth, teenagers Gimletide, and the fifth asleep forever in the mortuary, the sixth thing, gray in the mismatched eighth, and the ninth with Harrow roused and tight-lipped in her spare habit was accounted for. The ashes in the incinerator had been raked out and combed over, and the confirmation that they were human remains was not. Illuminating the surviving necromancers had gathered around a bowl of them, and they had all pounced on it like a bowl of peanuts. At a party only Corona Beth disdained, fingering a bunch of smuts and crumblings. They're much older than they ought to be. Chilianthe tried and Terry as cool as a cucumber, which was the first sign of hope for Pretzel hours. I would have said these belonged to a corpse 3 months dead. You're out by about 8 weeks, said Calamity's brow followed, which would still predate us significantly. Well, in either case, it's not him as anyone else died. Teacher, we have not held a funeral in a very long time, said Teacher a bit prissly, and at any rate we certainly would not have consigned them to the waste incinerator. Interesting you should say them. Ianthe had 2 small fragments on her palms. One of them was recognizably part of a tooth. For some reason this dental fact had Hero looking at Ianthe's palms, then Ianthe's palms again, as though both were suddenly the most fascinating things in the world. Gideon recognized this sudden diamond focus. Her hawk was re-estimating a threat, and they said idly, you see, there's at least 2 people in there, with the time signatures consistent throughout. The remains. She tipped both fragments into the palms of Calamity's. Happy birthday, she said. They must have died at the same time. Captain Ducha Ross said tersely, the incinerator is a snare. I'm as curious as anyone to know what's in there, but the fact remains that Pertussel ours is evidently not so. Where is he? I have set the servants to find him, said the first house priest. They will search every nook and cranny apart from your rooms, which I ask you to search yourselves on the bazaar. Chance that protest allows. The seventh is there. I will not breach the facility, nor will my servants. If you want to go down there, you must go down there yourselves. And then there is the outside of the tower. But if he left the tower, the water is very deep. Corona turned her chair around and straddled the seat, crossing her slim ankles. At the front, Gideon noticed that she and Ianthe had not entirely made up. In the wake of whatever fight, they must have had, their chairs were close together, but their bodies were angled away from each other. Corona shook her head again, as though to clear it of cobwebs. He must be alive. There's no motive. He was, any time I met him I thought he was perhaps the most boring man alive, supplied her twin, languidly wiping her hands. Corona flinched. And not even a classic 7th house ball. He hasn't subjected us to even one minimalist poem about cloud formations. Consider this. Maybe there's no motive. So John Marie Chatter, who refused to sheath her rapier, she had positioned herself and Isaac nearly back to back, as though united they could take all comers. Consider this. They went through the hatch just like Magnus and Abigail, and now he's dead, and she's about to kick the bucket. Would the fourth drop this insane monster fairy? Not insane, said Teacher to Nefarious. Oh no, not insane. Captain Duciers, who had been scribbling in her notepad, leant back in her chair and tossed down her pencil. I'd like to supply a more human mens rea. Yes. The Duchess Septimus and her cavalier had accessed the facility. Did they have any keys? Yes, said a voice at the door. Gideon hadn't noticed that chainmail-skirted whitewashed figure of Silas Octaches on leave, but she noticed him come back in. He entered the eating atrium from the kitchen side, looking pallid and unruffled, his bladed face as pitchless as ever, free from a normal human emotion. Yes, she does, he repeated. Or rather, she did. What the hell did you just do? Said Calamities quietly. Your aggression is unseemly and unwarranted, said Silas. I went to see her. I felt a certain responsibility. I was the one who asked for satisfaction, and Brother Ash had been ready to duel her missing cavalier. I did not want bad blood between us. I feel nothing but pity for the 7th house warden Sexters. You haven't answered my question. Silas felt about in his pocket and raised his hand to display its contents. It was one of the iron keyrings, and on it with 2 keys, one gray, one a familiar white. If foul play has befallen her cavalier, he said in his curiously deep voice, then the culprit will get no joy of it. I found her conscious keeping hold of this. She's surrendered it to me for safekeeping. That's dubious in the extreme, said Captain Deuteros, surrender them to me now in a show of good faith. Master Silas, if you please, I cannot in good conscience, until I know the fate of Protestor Lois the Seventh. Anyone here could be guilty. Brother Ashtir, the chainmail curdled boy, tossed the ring to his cavalier, who caught it out of the air and fished his own heavy keyring out of his pocket. Gideon noticed that their ring held a facility key, and one other in black wrought iron, with curlicue's column. The eighth locked the two rings together with a very final click. I'll keep these until such a time as she wants them, judging by our conversation. That may well be never. This was received with a brief silence. You careless bastard, shouted Naberius. You just went in heavy to nearly dead girl for her keys. John Marie said, you're just sorry you didn't think of it first. Chatter, if you say one more bloody word, I'll make sure you never get through puberty. Hold your tongue. Prince Turn said, Captain Jesus, I have bigger fish to fry than listening to you abuse a child. She stood. She took them all in with the face of a woman who had come to a final conclusion. This is where the tendon meets the bone. This key holding cannot continue. I told you before that the second house would take responsibility if nobody else had the stomach for it. That begins now. The slender necromancer in his pure eighth whites had slid into a chair profited by his nephew, and he sat straight-backed and thoughtful. Is that a challenge to me? Then, Captain, he said sorrowfully, your keep. The second adept thrust her chin toward Calamities, who had been sitting with fingers steepled beneath his jaw, staring through the walls, as though discord was so intensely distasteful that he could only distance himself from it. Warden, the sixth is the Emperor's reason I asked you earlier, and I'm telling you now. Hand over what keys you've won from my safekeeping. The sixth, the Emperor's reason blinks. With all respect, he said, piss off. Let the record state that I was forced into a challenge, said Lieutenant Dyes, and she peeled off one white glove. She threw it down on the table, looking Calamities dead in the eye. We, Jewel, I name the time, you name the place. The time is now. Jewel, the sixth school. Sean Marie, that's not fair. A perfect bubble broke out. Teacher rose with a curious, resigned expression on his face. I will not be party to this, he said, as though that was going to stop anyone, and he left the room. In the vacuum of his exit, Corona slapped both of her hands down on the table. Judas, you coward, pick on some on your own size. This is what happens, isn't it? The bad necromancy teen was in a stupid still. He sounded wondering, not angry. This is what happens with Magnus and Abigail gone. Yes, I'm sure Magnus the Fifth would have issued us a strongly worded memorandum. Anti not helping. Six, you mustn't accept. The third will represent the sixth in this, if they'll consent at arms. Babs, her twin sister's voice was thin and soft as silk. Don't unsheath that sword. In the various, he answered. What are you doing? I want to see how this plays out, she said with a panicked shrug, heedless of the growing eye in her twin's voice. Alas, I have a bad personality and a stupid fine deficit of attention. Well, perhaps, thank God, has much better sense than to listen to you. Perhaps. The Barry Sis hand was hesitating hard on the hilt. He had not sprung into action as proposed, nor had he flanked the commanding twin. He was staring at her pale shadow. Knuckles' white hand, still with a resentment very near hate. Corona's smile flickered. Perhaps through all this Palamides had sloped the weight of his head into one hand, then into the other, scrubbing his fingers down his long face. He had taken his glasses off and was tapping the thick frames against the table. His nail-gray stare had not left Judith Deuteros, whose own gaze was as resolute as concrete. Default, Warden, said the captain. You are a good man. Don't put your cavalier through this. Calamity seemed to snap out of it all at once, squeaking his chair legs horribly on the tiled floors. He scooted it backward and away from the table's edge. No, we're doing this, he said abruptly. I pick here, the captain said. Sextus, you're mad. Give her some dignity. He did not even stand, just crooked his fingers at his cavalier rather than tensing up in anticipation. As Gideon might have, Camilla had relaxed. She shook her dark fringe off her forehead, shivered out of her hood, and her cloak swung her neck back and forth like someone limbering up to dance. Oh, I am, he said. Come. Camilla hacked, stepped onto the wooden table with one long lean movement. She wore a long gray shirt and gray slacks beneath her cloak, and she looks less like a cavalier than an off-duty librarian. Still, they startled her audience, except for Lieutenant Dias, who vaulted up to the opposite side of the table, which creaked crossly beneath the strain. Dias had not bothered to take off her jacket. She slid her utilitarian and bone-sharp knife out of its cross-hip sheath and laid it there for display. With her main hand she drew her rapier, plain hilted, polished until it hurt. The sixth stared at her for a moment, as though she had no idea of the protocol. And then she drew both of her weapons at once in a way that nagged at the back of Gideon's brain. The rapier looked like Gideon's, maybe 1,000,000 years old. It was the first time she had seen it in a good light, and here it looked as though it had never been designed to take an edge blow. The blade was light and delicate as a cobweb. The offhand looked like Camilla's whole house had gone searching down the back of the sofa for weapons, but had come up with what looked more like a long hunting or hacking knife than a dueling dagger, thick, meaty, cross-guarded with a single sharpened edge. The whole effect was sadly amateurish. The lovely and miserable Corona Beth had shouldered forward to stand at the table, to positioned in the space between them. She called to Judith and Calamity's cleft to sack high or down, disarm legal necromancers. Mercy, said the second's necromancer calmly. Corona Beth sucked her breath through her teeth. Sextus, do you agree to the terms? I have no idea what any of that means, said Calamity's. Gideon drew forward to them, leaning in to hear Corona saying in an urgent whisper, Warden, that means she can hit your cavalier anywhere below the neck, and it ends only when you give in. She's being an absolute cad, and I'm not even slightly sorry for pantsing her when we were 8. Nor should you be. Don't let her make an example of you, said the princess. She's picking on you because you can't fight back like a bully kicking a dog. She's given herself leeway to hurt your cavalier very badly, and she will just to scare Octokizar on unknown Jesmus. No offense. Ninth, the warden of the sixth drummed his feet on the floor. Percussively he said, so you're saying her cavalier can do more or less anything? 2. My cavalier, all in the name of making me cry, uncle. Yes. From across the table, Captain Dutero said, Stanley, no more waiting to fault or fight. Corona, if you insist on arbitrating, arbitrate. Those exquisite eyes would have persuaded a stone to roll uphill, but finding no purchase with Calamity's. Corona raised her voice reluctantly to the mercy call. Highway down the neck is no exception. Point blade. Picasso. Offhand. Cool march of the second called Lieutenant Dish. Camilla did not call. She looks down at her necromancer and said, Warden, you can't hit her in the head. He said, I think I choose when you're done. Just tell me how to play it. Camilla raised her voice. Camilla the sixth. Gideon had moved back to her necromancer. Everyone else in the room looked grave. For a moment she thought the fourth were holding hands, but she realized Isaac was holding Jean-Marie back. His hand around her wrist was a clamp, and her face the picture of outrage. There were bleakly hungry faces. The pale Einth and Nibirius licking his lips, and then there were the eighth, who were filling their own bingo sheet by praying. Her hark looked as tall and distant as a hangman's rope, but something in Gideon's face must have caught her attention. She went from distant to bemused, and from bemused to something even a little bit offended. Gideon couldn't blame her. The general atmosphere was of a disapproving crowd before an execution, but she was trying and failing to smother a grin of savage anticipation. Corona was saying to paces back, can't turn. Damn, this is so hard to do on a table. Come. Calamity said, go loud and begin, said Corona Beth. Gideon had to give Doris her due. It took her much less time than it had taken Gideon fighting Nibiria's turn for the second to realize she was in trouble. Lieutenant Marta Dish was in every line of her a smart, efficient fighter, not given to folderol or showboating. At the very peak of her fitness, unlike the third, she was a soldier, far more used to fighting people who weren't moving to a playbook of legal dueling moves. She had trained her whole life with the front in mind, with veterans and bloodthirsty recruits. Her sword arm was balanced and light, her posture neat but not starchy. She was incredibly reactive, ready for any gambit her opponent could bring. Camilla hit her like a hurricane. She exploded forward with her rapier wide and her butcher's knife held close, knocking the lieutenant's hurried parry out the way and sliding away from a belated lunge. With the dagger she sliced her red gouge down Diasis' immaculate white jacket and shirt, bashed her across the knuckles with the hilt of her rapier, and kicked her in the knee for good measure. The kick was Cam's only mistake. The pain clearly set every neuron in Diasis' body shrieking with adrenaline. Someone like Nibirius would have been prone on the table from shock, probably bleeding and shitting, but the second kept her wits about her. She took the pain with a stagger, kept her footing, and held her blade and parried another sweeping blow from Camilla's knife. She moved back for breathing space, Camilla harassing her with strike after strike to get back inside her guard until she could move no more. She was after all fighting on a table. Camilla's foot lashed out to her offhand, and the dagger clattered to the ground. The second, with an honestly beautiful dodge and a perfect reaction, took her one opportunity and lunged. Dies was desperate, and Dies was off the second house. Cam fought like a grease fire, but she left herself too many openings. Dies' thrust would have pierced a lesser fighter right beneath the collarbone and run her through. It caught Camilla heck low in the right forearm as she nearly dodged it, piercing the meat next to the owner and making her snarl. She dropped her cobweb light rapier, grabbed Martyr's wrist, and yanked the arm. Dislocated with a bright pop. Lieutenant Dish didn't quite scream, but she got most of the way there. She windmilled at the edge of the table, still holding the wrist. Camilla stepped past her, kicked her legs out almost dismissively, and drove her down face first into the wooden boards. With a crunch, this left Camilla standing over her opponent, one foot pressed into the back of her neck, the dislocated arm pinned up at an angle that looks seriously uncomfortable. Dish made a strangled, agonized noise, and Judith Dutero's snapped Murphy Mercy called match to the sixth said Corona Beth, as though saying it faster would make it over sooner. There was silence, except for Camilla's ragged breathing and the lieutenant's tiny half-amazed gasps. Then Genre Marie said, "Hot dog." Both cavaliers were oozing blood. It dripped from Camilla's wound where the sword had stuck her, and it was soaking through Lieutenant Dias' shirt and dribbling from her nose, the exact same color as her neckerchief. She had her eyes screwed up tightly. Calamities was already standing beside the table, and with another excruciating noise, he set Marty's arm back inside its joint. This time she really did scream. Captain Duce Ross washed face, absolutely blank. "Your keys," he said. "I don't have." "Then your facility key, hand it over." "You have its exact copy." Calamities rounded on her with a sudden theory that made everyone jump, even Gideon. "Then maybe I'll throw it out the fucking window," he snarled. "To good calves hurt yours and mine all, because the second tried to beat up the weak kid first." He jammed a finger at Judith's immaculate waistcoat with intent to impale. She didn't flinch. "You have no idea how many keys we're holding. You have no idea how many keys anybody's holding, because you haven't paid any damn attention since the shuttles landed. You picked on us because the 6th aren't fighters. You could have fought Gideon the 9th or Callum the 8th. You fought Camilla because you wanted a quick win, and you didn't even watch her first. You just assumed you could take her, and I can't stand people who assume I had caused the second." Doggedly, "I don't care," said Calamities. "Isn't it funny how it took the second of all houses to blow this whole thing open? You stuck a target on the back of everyone toting a key. It's a free-for-all now, and it's your fault, and you'll pay for it. For God's sake, Warden, you misunderstand my intention. Give me your key." Captain wrote the scion of the 6th, or is the 2nd faithless, as well as dense here, said Lieutenant Diaz. She had mopped most of the blood away from her mouth and nose. Although her once white shirt was drenched with scarlet, she fumbled in her jacket pocket with her unhurt arm and held out a keyring adorned with a single key. Calamides gave her a cut nod, plucked it from her fingers, and turned his back on them both. Camilla was sitting on the edge of the table, her hand clapped over her wound, blood seeping freely from between her fingers. "Miss Simone," she said, "remember that you're using a rapier, please." "I'm not making excuses." But she was quick as hell. A voice interrupted. "I challenged the 6 for their keys. I named the time, and the time is now." Chapter 24. Everyone's heads followed the sound except for Anth Tridentarius, who was lounging in her chair with one eyebrow raised, and Nibirius Turn, who had issued the challenge. He vaulted to the table in one lustrous movement, swinging himself up to stand on it, even as Judith Duteros very carefully eased her cavalier down into an empty seat. He looks down at the mall with a hard snare, and the one stupid girl that he always managed to get right in the middle of his forehead. "No, you don't," said Corona Beth faintly. "Yes, she does," said Yanthi, rising to stand. "You need a facility key, don't you? Here's our chance. I suspect we won't be given a better." There was an expression of grim alarm rising on Judith Duceros's face. She had both hands across the oozing slit on her cavalier's chest, and she had paused in her work out of sheer annoyance. "You have no cause," she said. "Neither did you. If we're all being honest with ourselves, sex just was perfectly right. If you want to cast me as the villain, do it," said the captain. "I'm trying to save our lives. You're giving into chaos. There are rules." "Third, on the contrary, Ian," they said, "you've amply demonstrated that there are no rules whatsoever. There's only the challenge, and how it's answered. When she looked at her sister's stricken face, Corona was somewhere beyond fury and shame now and had lost every atom of her poise. She only said quite softly, "This is for you, dear, don't be picky. This may be the only chance we have. Don't feel bad, sweetheart. What can you do?" Corona's face changed. The struggle gave way to exhaustion. But at the same time, there was a weird relief in her. Her teeth were gritted, but one of her hands tangled in her sister's long, thin, ivory blonde locks, and she drew their heads close. "I can do nothing," she said, and Gideon realized they'd just lost her somehow then. "Let's do this together. I need you," echoed her twin, rather piteously. Camilla held herself up to stand. She had taken Palamides' handkerchief and bound her arm, but the blood was already showing through, and she held it in a funny way. Palamides looked close to vibrating out of his skin from fear or anger. "Right," she said laconically. "Second round." But Gideon was experiencing one powerful emotion, being sick of everyone's shit. She unsheathed her sword. She slid her gauntlet over her hand and tightened the wrist straps with her teeth, and she looked over her shoulder at Harrow Hark, who was apparently breaking out of a blue funk, to experience her own dominant emotion of "oh, not again." Gideon silently willed her necromancer to put her knuckle bones where her mouth was, and for the first time in her life, for the first real time, do what Gideon needed her to do. And Harold Hark rose to the occasion like an evening star. "The 9th house will represent the 6th house," she said, sounding cold and bored, as though this had been her plan all along. Gideon wanted to sing. Gideon wanted to dance her up and down the corridor. She broke out in a broad, unnervingly and 9th smile, and Nibiria's turn, who had gone from greasy villainy to a grieved caution, was having to force his smirk and say, "Just looked a little amused." The plot congeals. "Since when has the 9th been bosom with the 6th when not?" Then Harrowhawk said in the exact sepulchral tones of Marshall Croc's Death, verse 2. Vultures and scavengers, unable to bear it any longer, so Marie hopped up on the table till she held her shining 4th house rapier before her. The beautiful navy and silver fretwork of her dagger gripped in an altogether professional way at her hip, although her puffy eyes and corrugated, unbrushed hair proved that she had not slept more than a few hours in the last few days. She looked intimidatingly ready. Gideon was coming to the conclusion that despite an overworked pituitary gland, there was really something in the chatter name. After all, once you face her, you face the 4th house, she said ringingly. Fidelity. And the Emperor Nibirius turned, sheathed his sword and his neat gleaming knife, rolling his eyes so hard that they ought to have fallen backward into his sinuses. He sighed explosively and swung himself down from the table, wiping that stupid curl off his forehead with an airy head toss. "I should have stayed home and gotten married," he said resentfully, as though anyone was even offering. "Snappy, aren't they? If you have all finished," said Silas Saktakizran with his deep, tyrannically servile politeness. "Brother Ashton are going to go and look for Petezalaus the 7th. He is after all still missing, which will somehow involve trying those keys you've taken indoors you've never been able to open," said Calamities. "What a coincidence. I have no interest in talking to you anymore," said Silas. "The warden of the 6th house is an unfinished inbred who passed an examination. Your companion is a mad dog, and I doubt her legal claim to the title of Cavalier Primary. I would not even bother to thrash her. Enjoy the patronage of the shadow cult. While it lasts, I am sorry that it came to this. Brother Ash, we leave. When they dispersed, it was with the manner of people reluctantly turning their backs on their enemies. The 8th master swept out with his cavalier, like a legion retreating from a battlefield. The 2nd, the unsteady cavalier, supported by the captain's arm, looked even more so, with something of the tattered refugee thrown in. The 3 houses that were left looked at one another. Calamity is rounded on Harrow Hark, his hands bloody, and his shining eyes a little wild. He had torn off his spectacles, and there were greasy red thumbprints over the lenses. "There's only one more key," he said. Harry frowned. "One more to claim?" "No, they've all been claimed. I've been through every challenge, except the one. I won't play ball with Harrow's frown deepened fractionally, but Gideon was putting the pieces together. So too apparently was the necromantic teen Isaac. "If there's only one of each key," he said slowly. "What happens when you do a challenge someone else already completed?" Calamity shrugged. "Nothing. I mean, you can do the challenge, but you get nothing at the end of it," Jean-Marie said. "So it's just a huge waste of time." And Gideon could not imagine how she'd have felt after the evulsion room if the plinth at the other end had Then empty sort of the challenge itself is still instructional. It makes you think about things in a new way, right? Known adjustments the challenges so far, said Harrow, carefully have encouraged me to consider some striking possibilities, right? But it's like, imagine if someone showed you a new sword move or whatever, but then you never actually got to sit down and read up on how it worked. It might give you ideas, but you wouldn't really learn it. Do you follow? John Marie Gideon and Camilla all stared at him when he said the sixth lone sword fighting out of a book, said John Marie, horrified. No, put in Camilla. The warden just hasn't been to Swordsman's Spire since he was 5 and got lost. Okay, Palamides put his hands out. He was still holding the blood-stained spectacles. That was clearly an in opposite comparison, but a challenge taken purely as a necromantic exercise, said Harrow calmly. Suggests many things, but reveals none. Only the underlying theorem can lay bare the mystery, and the theorems are behind the locked doors, Isaac said meditatively. Aren't they? You need the keys for the doors, or you're screwed. Everyone's attention was on the two shitty teens. They both looked back with no small scorn, all grief uncombed. Hair and stud earrings. We know about the doors, said Genre. We seen the doors and people go through the doors. Well, what else could we do? She added somewhat defensively. If we hadn't been trailing everybody, it would have been that creepy. And they Tridentarius, and she's stalking everyone, believe me. And trailing differs from stalking. How? Because the Force doesn't stalk. Nothing was preventing you from getting your facility key, said Calamities. Isaac said emptily. Abigail said to wait for her. Gideon did not know how much the sixth knew about the keys they'd amassed so far, or what they'd learned of the labs and the studies, how much they knew of the theorems. Palamides was nodding thoughtful. Well, you've come to the right conclusion. Behind the doors there are studies, and all 8, there's 8, obviously 1 per house, contain notes on the relevant theorem. All 8 theorems presumably add up to some kind of a mega theorem, supplied Isaac, who after all was like 13 mega theorem. He agreed. The key to the secrets of liquor. Who'd? Jean-Marie Chatter's brain had obviously ground forward, struggling past confusion and puberty hormones to some slowly formed conclusion. Wait, go back. 6th house, she demanded. What did you mean by 1 more key? Calamities drummed his fingers on the table. Well, forgive me the explanation lines. I know you've been keeping track of the keys. Ha ha ha, thought Gideon she hadn't. But I couldn't work out how many keys Lady Septimus had. I knew she had at least 1, but when Octachusron convinced her to hand them over, he freighted convinced with such heavy scorn, it'd also have fallen through the floor. He accidentally showed us her card. She had to. That means there's 1 left that I haven't accounted for, and we've got to account for it. We need to find the 7th cave. It is Camilla. He nodded yes. And we also have to work out who the hell's in the incinerator. Dente Tridentarius was right. A sentence I don't like saying, in that there's more than 1 person in there. Isaac said, I have a duty to find out who killed Magnus and Abigail first and foremost. You're right, Baron Tessera, said Palamity is warmly. But trust me, I think answering those 3 questions will help us quite considerably in solving that mystery. 9th protester Lois was still down in the facility as of last night. Harrow looked at him blankly. How do you know? We saw him go into the 4th as one, and Isaac added, after we eavesdropped on you, and the 6th. Good for you. But it makes sense to Lady Septima said he didn't come back, and when we saw her curing just now, it only had challenge keys, no hatch key. She must have given that to him so he could access the facility by himself, although why I still don't know. I bet you the whole of my library's physical sciences section that he's still down there. It would be impossible for someone to bring him up without being seen. Then we need to go down and look. So John Marie, visibly impatient at the lack of action. Let's go. Don't be so forth, said Calamities. We should split up. We're fighting a battle on 2 fronts here. Frankly, I would not leave Lady Septimus unguarded. Son's cavalier with just the 1st house to guard her. Her heart said her keys are gone. What's the attraction now? Camilla said. Vulnerability. Yes, it can't just be a game of keys known as Jezumus. Why did Magnus Quinn and Abigail Pent die when they have nothing on them but a facility key in their own good selves? Why has Princess Alawas gone missing when the most he would have had was his facility key? Is he still down there? Who died before this challenge even began? And then there's the issue of the other houses. I do not know about you, Reverend daughter, but until comes healed up, I plan on wedding myself lavishly. Isaac gave a rather lame and high-pitched giggle. Camilla said gruffly, Warden, Is just my right hand haka her just your right hand my right hand more like God come, I've never been so scared in all my life. Harrow Hark ignored this cavalier necromancer banter and cleared her throat pointedly. Septimus, once guarding her cavalier, should be found. What do you suggest? The fourth house stays with the Lady Dulcinea, said Palamide, slipping his glasses back over his long nose. Gideon, the ninth stays with them as backup. UI and Camilla go down to the facility and see if we can locate Princess Allows. There was more than one bewildered stare aimed his way. His own cavalier looked at him as though he had taken leave of his senses, and Harrow yanked her hood off her head painfully, as though to relieve her feelings. Sexta, she said, as though to a very stupid child, your necromancer is wounded. I could kill the both of you and take your keys, or just take your keys, which would be worse. Why would you willingly put yourself in that position? Because I am placing my trust in you, said Calamities. Yes, even though you're a black anchorite and loyal only to the numerous forces of the Loctum. If you'd wanted my keys through chicanery, you would have challenged me for them a long time ago. I don't trust Silas Octachazaran, and I don't trust Eanthi Tridentarius, but I trust the Reverend Daughter Harrow Hark Noni Azimus. Beneath the paint, Gideon could see that Harrow had changed colors a number of times through this little speech. She went from being a rather ashes skeleton to a skeleton who was improbably green around the gills. To an outsider, it would have just been a blank ninth house mask twinging from dark mystery to cryptic mystery, giving nothing away. But to Gideon, it was like watching fireworks go off. Her necromancer said roughly, fine, but we'll watch over the seventh house. I'm not going down the ladder with your invalid cavalier. Calamity said, fine, perhaps that's better use of our talents anyway. Fourth, are you all right to go with Gideon the ninth? I realize I am presupposing that our motives all align, but all I can assure you is that they really do search the facility, and if you find him or come up short, come back to us and we'll move from there. Get in and get out. The blurry necromantic teen looked to his blurry cavalier. Jean-Marie said, immediately, we'll go with the ninth. She's all right. The stories about the ninth has seen probably bullshit anyway. She's all right. Gideon's heart billowed, despite the fact that she had her own suspicions as to why her necromancer didn't want her sitting with Dulcinea. Septimus, and they were all extremely petty. The sixth house adept adjusted his glasses again and said, sorry, Knight Cavalier, I should ask you your thoughts on all of this. She cracked the joints in the back of her neck as she considered the question, stretching out the ligaments, popping her knuckles. He urged again, thoughts. Gideon said, did you know that if you put the first three letters of your last name with the first three letters of your first name, you get sex, pal? The dreadful teens both stared with eyes so wide you could have marched skeletons straight through them. You talk, said Isaac. You wish she didn't, said Camilla. Her wound had opened again. Calamities were searching his pockets and the sleeves of his robe for more handkerchiefs to staunch it as the force conducted a quick conversation in what they thought were whispers. Hera came to Gideon and unwillingly passed over the great iron ring that their keys jingled on, Bada's almost pressing so that she could keep them out of sight of Calamities. Come back with these, or having choked on them, she whispered, and don't get complacent around the fourth. Never work with children. Griddle, their prefrontal cortexes aren't developed now. Gideon put her arms around Harrow Hark. She lifted her up off the ground just an inch and squeezed her in an enormous hug. Before either she or Harrow knew what she was about, her necromancer felt absurdly light in her grip, like a bag of bird's bones. She had always thought, when she bothered to think, that Harrow would feel cold, as everything in the ninth felt cold. No, Harrow Noni Azimus was feverishly hot. Well, you couldn't think that amount of ghastly thoughts without generating energy. Hang on, what the hell is she doing? Thanks for backing me up, my midnight Haggett, said Gideon, placing her back down, who had not struggled but gone limp like a prey animal fainting death. She had the same glassy 1,000-yard stare and stilled breathing. Gideon belatedly wished to be exploded, but reminded herself to act cool. I appreciate it, my crepuscular queen. It was good you were good. Harrow, at a total loss for words, eventually managed the rather pathetic "don't make this weird, Nav," and stalked off after Calamities. So Marie sided up alongside Gideon rather shyly. Isaac was parasitically drifting with her. He was in the process of braiding her curly hair safely up with a tatty blue ribbon. She said, have you been paired a very long time? Don't just ask them, that the necromancer hissed. It's a weird thing to ask, shut up. It was just a question. Gideon contemplated the growing braid, and the sight of Calamity squeezing the noxious contents of a blue dropper into Camilla's wound and Camilla kneeing him with beautiful abruptness in the thigh. Harrow Hark lurked next to them pointedly, not looking at Gideon, head hidden deep inside her second-best hood. She still didn't understand what she was meant to do or think or say, what duty really meant between a cavalier and a necromancer. Between a necromancer and a cavalier it feels like forever, she said honestly. Gideon slipped her dark-tinted glasses out of her pocket and slid them on, and she felt better for it. Come on, let's go. Chapter 25. Despite the fact that they now knew Gideon had a working pair of vocal reeds and the will to use them, the trip down to the facility was spent in silence. Any travel into the depths of the first house put both of the teens on high alert. They were so paranoid they would have been welcomed into the dark bosom of the suspicious ninth, both startled at every shadow and watched the passing by of creaking skeletons. With no little hate and despair, they did not like the open terrace where the waves howled far below, nor the cool marble hallway, nor the marble stairwell that led down to the nondescript room with the hatch to the facility. They only spoke when Gideon slipped her facility key into the hatch and turned it with a sharp click. It was Jean-Marie, and she was troubled. We still don't have a key, she said. Maybe we shouldn't be here. Abigail died, and she had permission, said her counterpart. Somebody who cares. I'm just saying I've been down without permission, said Gideon as she used one booted foot to ease the hatch open. Cold air wheezed out like a pent-up ghost. The six let me in once without a key, and I'm still breathing. Jewelry seemed uncomforted and unconvinced, so she added, hey, look at it this way. You were down here just the other night, so if that's the sticking point, you're already totally boned. You don't talk like how I thought you might talk, said Isaac. All three traveled down the cold, dark staple ladder to the fluorescent lights and dead stillness of the landing. Gideon went first, the other two lagged behind, a little captivated by the increasingly old and bloody gobbets that still decorated the grill at the bottom. She had to herd them forward down the tunnel that led to the radial room, to the ancient whiteboard and the signs above the warren of corridors. She turned. Jean-Marie and Isaac had not come with her. Jean-Marie had stopped in the doorway, pressing herself flat against it, looking around at the strange, anachronistic tunnels of steel and plate metal and LED lighting. I thought I heard a noise, she said, eyes darting back and forth, coming from where she didn't answer. Isaac, who had pressed himself into the shadows where the side of the doorway met the wall, said, nice. Why were born fragments found in Magnus's body and in Abigail's? Don't know. It's a good question. At first I thought it meant the skeletons, he said in a sunken whisper, which made sense from the nonsense of why he and his cavalier had jumped at the creaking approach of each bone servant in the place. There's something unnatural about the constructs upstairs, like they're listening to you. Gideon looked back at both of them. They had pressed themselves into either side of the corridor, not daring to come into the open space. Pupils very dilated, as though with adrenaline, they both looked at her, the young cavalier with her brown eyes muddy in the darkness, the young necromancer with his deep hazel eyes and spider-leggy mascara. Pressurized air from some cooling fan wheezed through a vent, making the ceiling creak. Come on, don't just lurk there, said Gideon impatiently. Let's find this guy. It shouldn't be too hard. He's massive. Neither wanted to be coaxed out. Their puff had seemed to leave them. They clustered close together, grave-faced and tense. Isaac raised a hand, and faint ghost-like flames appeared at his fingertips, bluish-greenish, giving off a sickly little light that did not do much to illuminate what was going on around them. He insisted on warding every single radiating doorway, dropping blood, and his cavalier spit around the mouth of each corridor. He was nervous and crabby, and it was slow work applying team gunge to every single exit. His enclosures are good, Jean-Marie kept saying defensively. I thought the fourth were meant to be all about head-first dives and getting all crazy, said Gideon, who stared hard into every shadow. It's stupid to get killed if it doesn't help, said Isaac, tracing his thumb in curious shapes along the door jamb. The fourth isn't cannon fodder. If we're first on the ground, we need to stay alive. Wards were the first thing I learned. When we get shipped down next year, we'll get them scarified onto our backs next year. Gideon was taught with impatience, but still spent a couple of seconds grappling with the notion that the gawky teens in front of her would be facing the Empire's foes at age 15. and whatever for all that she'd longed to be on the front lines from the age of 8 up it. Suddenly didn't seem like such a great idea. We wanted to go this year, so the Cavalier Dollarsley. But Isaac got mumps a week before deployment. Remembrance of Isaac's mumps threw them both into gloom, but at least that diluted their terror in the end. Gideon found herself leading them down the hallway marked sanitizer, the place where she had first found her, their 3 pairs of feet kicked up, huge scuffs of white powder glowing mixed colors under Isaac's necrolite settling down in silent sprays in the panel, grinding to nothing beneath their footsteps. The doors moaned open to the paneled maze of stainless steel cubicles, and the vents moaned too, and sympathy creaking so much that the teens both gritted their molars. Per's old blood was still here, but Protesilaus wasn't. They all split up to walk the maze of metal tables, checking beneath them to see if he had laying down for a swift nap or something equally probable. The proud rows of metal cubicles all empty. They called out hello, and Princess Lois, their voices reverberating thinly off the walls. As the echoes faded, they heard the scuttling noises of air being blown through the vents. Metal teeth. There's something here, Isaac said. They all listened. Gideon could hear nothing but the sounds of old machinery running in the same exhausted way it had run for thousands of years, kept alive by perfect mechanism and necromantic time. They were no different from the background noises of the 9th. How she said, I can't hear it. It's not just hearing, said Isaac, brow following. It's more what I'm feeling. There's movement here, John Marie said. Another how Snow Woods nothing. She stalked the facility with her rapier drawn and her dagger clutched in her hand. Gideon, stranger to teamwork, worried that if she startled her by accident she'd end up with the 4th offhand in her gut. Isaac said, bodies were brought into here a long time ago, a lot of bone matter. The first feels like a graveyard all over, but this is worse. I'm not faking, I believe you, said Gideon. Some of the stuff I've seen down here would ruin your eyelids. I don't know what the hell they were researching, but I don't like it. Only bright side is that it's all pretty self-contained. I'm not super certain, said the adept. Sweat was beading on his brow. John Murray said, he's not in here. Let's go somewhere else. They left the bright antiseptic room of sanitizer. The lights went off with rhythmic boom boom booms as Gideon pressed down on the touchpad that still held little black hurls of Harrow's blood, and they spilled out into the corridor. Sweat was openly dripping down the sides of Isaac's temples. Now his Cavalier threw her arm over his shoulder, and he buried his hot wet face in her shoulder. Gideon again found this difficult to look at. Let's bounce, said John Marie as they turned the corner to where the sanitizer corridor met the main artery. The rhythmic boom 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 of light shutting down caught up with them. The lights in the grill beneath them winked out of existence, and so did the dully glowing panels above, and so did the bright lights ringing the big square room ahead. They were left in total darkness, every nerve in Gideon's body singing with fear. She ripped her glasses off to try to cope. The Necromancer was close to hyperventilating. His Cavalier kept saying with eerie calm, your words aren't tripped, it's just the lights. Don't freak out, the wards aren't tripped, you're good with wards. There's nobody down here. One of the motion sensor lights struggled back on behind them. A short way down the passage, a ceiling panel through the metal siding into sharp white relief. It was doped with words that had not been there a few seconds before, written in blood so fresh and red that there were little drips. Death to the 4th house. The light flickered off after no sleep, after days of threat and grief and panic that would have flawed a man twice his age. Isaac lost it completely. With a strangled cry he fled in a halo of blue and green. John Marie yelled, Isaac, behind me. But he was sizzling with light, too bright to see by a sun, and not a person. Gideon heard him flee into the room ahead of them, blinded by the running aurora. When her eyes cleared, Gideon was confronted with the biggest skeletal construct she had ever seen. The room was full of it, bluely aflame, with Isaac's light a massed hallucination of bones. It was bigger by far than the one in response, bigger than anything recorded in a 9th history textbook. It had assembled itself into the room by no visible means, since it never could have fit through one of the doors. It was just simply suddenly there, like a nightmare, a squatting for indigenous hulk, a nonsense of bones feathering into long spidery legs, leaning back on them fearfully, and daintily trailing jellyfish stingers made up of millions and millions of teeth all set into each other like a jigsaw. It shivered its stingers, then stiffened, all of them at once with a sound like a cracking whip. that was so much of it was cringing away from Isaac Tetris, who had planted his feet wide in line with his hips and was screaming soundlessly in fear and anger. He had thrown his arms out wide as though in embrace, and there was a sodium explosion in the air between him and the room cramping construct. It left a suction, like he was trying to drag something out of the unwilling creature. Bright blue points of contact appeared on it, and the mass of bone and energy began to lose form, drifting instead toward Isaac, tiny bones blinking down to the grill like rain. Gideon woke from her confusion, drew her sword, and ran. With a gauntleted hand she picked up the nearest stinger and yanked it, then smashed the back of her heavy glove into another, finding a naked shank of leg bone and punching it as hard as she could. One of the tendrils of teeth wrapped around her ankle, but she found purchase and stamped it into a corona of molars. Gideon looked behind her to see Jean-Marie whipped off her feet by another tendril, lashing out wildly with her feet, and her blades everywhere she looked was filled with construct. Everywhere Isaac's light touched there was a veritable cancer of bone and tooth. Gideon bellowed, voice deadened by 1,000,000,000 friggin' bones. Run, don't fight it, run. But the enormous thing slapped another couple dozen tendrils down on the grill, sinuous and flexed into long sharp wires. Isaac's blue green fire fell upon a giant trunk of bone, a skull terrifically mangled into the thing's only coherent core, a simulacrum of a face with closed eyes and closed lips as though locked perpetually in prayer. This first mask loomed down from the ceiling and strained beneath Isaac's pull. One of the tendrils gave in and was sucked into the vortex that the fourth house was so valiantly creating. The spirit pinned to it was dissolving, the limb pattering into individual bits, one among hundreds. Isaac did not stop, and he did not run. It was one of the bravest and stupidest things Gideon had ever fucking seen. The construct teetered, getting its footing, cocking its great head as though in contemplation. The long straight spars of teeth hovered above the necromancer, bobbing and whooping occasionally as though about to be sucked into his fiery dryer. Then at least 50 of them spared him through blue fire, and blood sprayed the room. Gideon sheathed her sword, set her shoulders, put one arm up above her eyes, and charged through the field like a rocket. It was like running through a landslide. 1,000 fragments of bone ripped her robes to shreds and tore at every inch of exposed skin. She didn't pay them any mind, but crashed into genre Chatua like the vengeance of the Emperor. Jean-Marie had no intention of stopping. She was tearing into her unbeatable foe as though running away had never been in question. She barely seemed to notice that Gideon had grabbed her limbs, thrashing her throat. One long howl that Gideon only translated later. Fidelity, fidelity, fidelity. How she scrambled through that hallway. The other girl clutched to her bosom long tendrils of bones, sneaking after them from the central room. She did not know the fact that she shinnied up the ladder with Jean-Marie attached. Kicking and screaming was even more unlikely. She tossed the cavalier down. She would have been surprised if the girl had even felt it. Slammed the hatch lid and turned the key so frantically that it made gouges in the metal. So Marie rolled over on the cold black tiles, and she threw up. She pulled herself up on her bone-whipped, cut-up Bastion, arms and legs wobbling, and she began to shake. She sank back to her knees and screamed like a whistle. Gideon caught her up again. The grief-stricken teenager thrashed and bit and started off on a jog away from the hatch. Jean-Marie kept kicking in her arms. Put me down, she wept. Let me go back. He needs me. He could still be alive. He's seriously not, said Gideon. Jean-Marie the Force screamed. Again, I want to die, she said afterward. Tough luck she did at least stop kicking. The myriad cuts over Gideon's hands and face was starting to really sting, but she paid them no mind. It was still a deep black night outside, and the wind was howling around the side of Canaan House. She carried Jean-Marie inside and down the big rotting staircase, and then she absolutely blanked on what to do next. The fourth house cavalier couldn't even stand. She was reduced to the small disbelieving sobs of someone whose heart had broken forever. It was the second time Gideon had listened to Jean-Marie really cry, and the second time was a lot worse than the first. She had to get her to safety. Gideon wanted her long sword, and she wanted her. There were the ninth quarters, but bone wards could be broken, even harrows. She could march straight to where the others were guarding Dulcinea, but that was a long way to go with her catatonic cargo, and if she met an avaricious Nibirius or an over-obedient column, she'd still prefer them to whatever was down there in the facility. In the dark, Gideon's hand was still gripping the key ring, with the facility key she had just now so frantically used, and the red key on it, and lightning struck. Summary did not ask where they were going. Gideon ran down the soggy Canaan house staircase and across silent nighttime corridors and down the sloping little passage that led to the foyer for the training rooms. She pushed aside the tapestry and sprinted down the hall to the great black door that Harrow had called X-03. The door and the lock was so black in the night, and she was so slippery with fear that for an excruciating minute she couldn't seem to find the keyhole. And then she found it and slid the red key home and opened the door to the long-abandoned study. The rail of spotlights all lit up, illuminating the clean laminate countertops of the laboratory and the still shining wooden stairs to the living room. She slammed the door shut behind them and locked it so quickly that it ought to have broken the sound barrier. Gideon half-heaved, half-carried Jean Marie up the staircase and put it down on the squashy armchair, which wheezed with the sudden use. The sorrowful teen curled into a fetal position, bleeding and hiccuping. Gideon barreled away and started taking stock of the room, wondering if she could haul the big wooden bookcases down as barricades. Where are we? The Force eventually said drearily. One of the key rooms. We're safe here. I'm the only one with a key. What if it breaks down the door? Gideon said bracingly. Are you kidding? That thing's 3-inch thick iron. This neither comforted nor satisfies Genre, who had possibly seen a makeshift blockade in the other girl's eyes, but her crying diminished every 5 seconds. Another sob would rack her, but she had swapped weeping for historical sucked-in breath until she said it's not fair and started up again with the great lung-filling fits of tears. Gideon had moved before the aged gun, frightened into wondering whether or not it worked. Who knew the sword still all held edges? No, it's not. You don't understand. The Cavalier was fighting for control, fierce eyes wet with hate and despair. She was shivering so hard that she was vibrating. Isaac's cautious, not reckless. He's not, he didn't, he was always so careful. Shouldn't have I hated him when we were little? He wasn't at all what I wanted. She gave in to crying again. When she could, she said, it's not fair. Why did he get stupid now? There was absolutely nothing Gideon could say to this. She needed more firepower than bookcases and antiques. What she badly needed was Hero Nona Jazumas, for whom a gigantic construction of bones would be more fun opportunity than hellish monstrosity. And she needed her long sword, but she couldn't leave Genre Marie, and right now Genre Marie was a liability. She mopped her hands over her bleeding face, demolishing her face paint and trying to get her thoughts straight and settled on, look, we'll stay in here until you're fighting fit. Don't try to tell me you're fit. You're exhausted, you're in shock, and you look like hot puke. Take half an hour, lie down, and I'll get you some water. It took an enormous effort to get Jean Marie onto one of the dusty mattress squeaking beds, a much more effort to get her to take even tiny sips of the water that came out of the tap at the laboratory. Pipes rattled in shock that they were being used in a little tin mug that had probably not had anybody's lips near it since the 9th house was young. The recalcitrant teen drank a little, rested her head on the spongy old pillow, and her shoulders shook for a long time. Gideon settled down in the overstuffed armchair and kept her rapier out over her knees. What was that thing? Gideon startled. She had been lulled into a fog of reverie, and Jean Marie's voice was thick with weeping. And the pillow tonight, she said, all I know is that I'm going to kick its ass for it. Another moment's silence. Then, this is the first time Isaac and me really left the house. I wanted him to sign us up to go out to the front ages ago, but Abigail said no, and he wouldn't. I mean, he's got 3 younger brothers and 4 younger sisters to look after. He had, I mean, it sounded as though she was going to burst into tears again. Gideon said, that's a significant amount. You need spares when you're in the 4th house. So Jean Marie, sniffling, I've got 5 sisters. Do you have a big family? The Knights doesn't do big families. I think I'm an orphan. Well, that's pretty. 4th house to said the cab. My mom jumped on a grenade during the Pioneer expedition, even though she wasn't supposed to be out on post-colony planets. Beyond the rim, Isaac's dad went out on a state visit to hold a planet and got blown up by insurgents. There was no more after that, not even tears after a few minutes. Gideon was not surprised to see that the poor bloodied girl had cried herself unconscious. She did not wake her. There would be time enough to wake her, and even a short rest would probably do her good. It sucked to be a teen, and it sucked more to be a teen whose best friend had just died in a horrible way. Even if you were used to mothers jumping on grenades and fathers getting exploded, at least in the 9th house, the way you usually went was pneumonia exacerbated by senility. Gideon rested her head on the fat back of the armchair. She would not have said it was at all possible, but watching the rise and fall of Genre's breath, a safe up and down rhythm, the drying tear stains on the sleeping teen's cheeks, she promptly fell asleep. It couldn't have been long, 15 minutes. At the very most, she startled awake with the sheer unconscious panic of someone realizing they couldn't afford to slip into deep REM, a haptic jerk flicking her awake. Her sword rattled off her knees and jangled to the floor. The only sound that could have woken her was a persistent drip she thought was coming from the tap. Gideon did not understand what she was looking at when she awoke, and when she cleared her eyes and looked properly, she still didn't understand. Jean-Marie was still lying prone in the old bed, arms and legs now flung wide, as if she had kicked off the blankets and sheets in a bad dream. This would have been fine except for the huge shafts of bones spearing each shoulder to the mattress, to more through the thighs, one straight through the very center of her ribs. These spears of bone measure Marie's body, with halos of red splotching through her clothes, seeping into the bedspread. No, said Gideon meditatively. No, 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 no. Jean-Marie's eyes were very slightly open. There was blood splattered in her curls, and there was blood splattered over the headboard. Gideon's gaze followed the splatter upward. Written on the wall in silky wet red was "Sweet Dreams, Act for Chapter 26. Side by side, the 4th teens were laid to an uneasy sleep in the morgue right next to the adults who had failed so terminally to look after them. Somebody had, how it was a mystery, taken the cooling body from Gideon's arms, who had plucked those spears from those terrible holes and carried your Marie back, and a lot of people had spoken a lot of words to her, none of which had pierced her short-term memory. Teacher was there in her mind's eye, praying over the broken sieve of Isaac. Teterus and Hurlhark was in there somewhere too, and Palamides tweezering a big fragment of something out of the cooling corpse of Genre. The force, these images were as jumbled up and lacking in context as a dream. She remembered one thing: Harrowhark saying, "You dollard, you imbecile, you fool," all the old contempt of the 9th house nursery back and fresh as though she were there again. Harrow the architect sweeping down the halls of Draper. Harrow the nemesis flanked by Crocs. It wasn't clear what in particular Harrow was arranging her for, but whatever the reason, she deserved it. Gideon had tuned out all the rest of the Necromancers' tirade, her head in her hands, and then Harrowhark had pulled up her fists, breathed hard once through her nose and gone away. The only thing that had made sense was that she had ended up in the whitewashed room where they were keeping Dulcinea sitting alone in an armchair, and there she had gritted tears out of her eyes for an hour. Someone had washed out all her cuts with reeking vermilion terry stuff, and it smelled bad and hurt like hell whenever an errant drip of salt water touched the wounds. This made her feel sorry for herself, and feeling sorry for herself made her eyes even wetter. Dawsonia Septimus was a good person to do this in front of. She did not say, "You'll be fine," as Dawsonia lacked the lung capacity to spend on platitudes. She just sat propped up on about 15 pillows and kept her thin hot hand on Gideon's palm. She waited until Gideon had stopped her hard blinking, and then she said, "There was nothing you could have done." "Bullshit, there wasn't anything I could have done," said Gideon. "I thought of everything I should have done. There's about 50 things I could have done and didn't." Dawsonia gave her a crooked smile. She looked terrible. It was a few hours before morning, and the early light was gray on her biscuit-colored curls and blanched skin, defying green veins at her throat and wrists seemed terribly prominent, like most of her epidermis had sloughed off already. When she breathed, it sounded like custard sloshing around an air conditioner. There was high color in her cheeks, but it had the hectic brilliance of hot slag. "All could have, should have," she said. "You could have, and should have yourself back into last week, back into the womb. I could have kept Pro by my side, or I should have gone with him. I can go back and make things happen perfectly if I just think about what I should have or could have done. But I didn't." "You didn't. That's the way it is. I can't bear it," said Gideon. "Honestly, it's just such crap. Life is a tragedy," said Dulcinea, "left behind by those who pass away, not able to change anything at all. It's the total lack of control. When somebody dies, their spirit's free forever, even if we snatched it, or try to stop it, or use the energy it creates. Oh, I know sometimes they come back, or we can call them in the manner of the 5th, but even that exception to the rule shows their mastery of us. They only come when we beg. Once someone dies, we can't grasp at them anymore, thank God, except for one person, and he's very far from here. I think Gideon, don't be sorry for the dead. I think death must be an absolute triumph. Gideon could not get behind this. John Marie had died like a dog while Gideon napped, and Isaac had been made into a big teenage colander. She wanted to be sorry for them forever, but before she could say anything to this effect, a great cough that filled up about 2.5 handkerchiefs to it. Dulcinea, the contents of these handkerchiefs made Gideon envy the dead, let alone Dulcinea. We'll find your calf, she said, trying to sound steady and failing so completely. She set a record. I just want to know what happened, said Dulcinea drearily. That's always the worst of it, not knowing what happened. Gideon didn't know whether she could get behind this either. She would have been devoutly grateful to live, not knowing exactly the things that had happened in vivid red and purple wobbling intensity. Then again her mind kept flaying itself over Magnus and Abigail down there in the dark alone over the wind, and the how over whether Magnus had watched his wife be murdered like John Marie had watched Isaac. She thought it is stupid for a cavalier to watch their necromancer die. Gideon felt hot and empty and eager to fight. She said, without real hope, if you want your keys back from Silas Octakizaron, I'll deck him for you. The coughing turned into a bubbling laugh. Don't, said Dulcinea, I gave them up freely by my own will. What would I want with them now? Gideon asked boldly. Why were you trying to do this whole thing in the first place? Do you mean even though I'm dying? Dulcinea gave a friable smile, but one with a dimple in it. That's not a complete barrier. The seventh house thinks my condition is an asset. They even wanted me to get married and keep the genes going. My genes couldn't be worse in case they produced poetry down the line. I don't understand. The woman in front of her shifted, raising her hand to brush a few fawn-colored strands away from her forehead. She didn't answer for a while, then she said, when you don't have it too badly, when you can live to maybe 50 years, when your body is dying from the inside out, when your blood cells are eating you alive the whole time, it makes for such a necromancy. Gideon the ninth, a walking Thanergy generator. If they could figure out some way to stop you when you're mostly cancer and just a little bit woman, they would. But they can't. They say my house loves beauty. They did, and they do, unless a kind of beauty in dying beautifully and wasting away half alive, half dead. Within the very queenhood of your power, the wind whistled thin and lonely against the window. Dulcinea struggled to raise herself up on her elbows before Gideon could stop her, and she demanded, do I look like I'm at the queenhood of my power? This would have made anyone sweat. Oh, if you lie, I'll mummify you. You look like a bucket of ass. Dulcinea eased herself back down, giggling fretfully. Gideon, she said, I told your necromancer I didn't want to die, and it's true, but I've been dying for what feels like 10,000 years. I more didn't want to die alone. I didn't want them to put me out of sight. It's a horrible thing to fall out of sight. The seventh would have me sealed in a beautiful tomb and not talked about me again. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction, so I came here when the Emperor asked me, because I wanted to, even though I knew I came here to die. Gideon said, but I don't want you to die, and realized a second afterwards that she had said it aloud. The first finger and thumb of the hand ringed around hers. The dark blue eyes were luminous to luminous. The luster was wet and hot and bright, and Gideon pressed those fingers between her hands very carefully. It felt as though even a little bit of pressure would crush Dulcinea to dust between her palms. Let the very oldest bones kept in the ninth house. Os, her heart felt sore and tender, her brain felt sore and dry. I don't plan on it, you know. So Dulcinea, though her voice was thinning out now like water poured into milk, she closed her eyes with a gravelly sigh. I'll probably live forever. Worst luck would ever happen to one flesh one. And I've seen those words before, said Gideon, thoughtless of where she had seen them. What do they mean? The blue eyes cracked open. They're not familiar. Should they be? Well, so Dulcinea calmly, you would have said them to your reverend daughter the day you pledged yourself in the service of her cavalier, and she would have said them to you. But you never did that, did you? You weren't trained in the traditions of the House of the Locked Tomb, and you're nothing like a ninth house nun, and you fight like, I don't know, I'm not even certain you were raised in the ninth house. Gideon let her head rest against the bed frame momentarily. When she had thought about this moment, she had expected to feel panic There was no more panic left in the box. She just felt tired, rumbled. She said, I'm sick of pretending, so yeah, right on nearly all those counts. You know, I'm the fakest cavalier. Whoever faked the actual calf had chronic hyperthyroid and was a serial limp dick. I've been faking my way through his duties for less than 2 months. I'm a pretend cavalier. I could not be worse at it. The smile she got in return had no dimples. It was strangely tender, as Dulcinea was always strangely tender with her, as though they had always shared some delicious secret. You're wrong there, she said. If you want to know what I think that you're a cavalier worthy of a liquor. I want to see that what you'd become. I wonder if the reverend daughter even knows what she has in you. They looked at each other, and Gideon knew that she was holding that chemical blue gaze too long. Dulcinea's hand was hot on hers now. The old panic of confession seemed to rise up. Her adrenaline was getting a second wind from deep down in her gut. And in that convenient moment, the door opened. Calamity's Sextus walked in with his big black bag of weird shit, adjusted his glasses, and stared 2 seconds too long at their hands' proximity. There was something dreadfully tactful and remote and unpalama disease as he said, I came to check in on the both of you, but time only in the I am officially out, said Gideon, snatching her hand away. Everyone was mad at her, which was great, albeit they could not possibly be as mad as she was. She stood and rolled her neck until all the joints popped and crackled anxiously, was relieved to find her rapier still on her hip, and squared up to Calamity's, feeling terrifically dusty and guilty. I'm going back to my quarters. No, I'm fine. Quit it. Thanks for the ointment. It smells bewitchingly like piss. For God's sake, Ninth, said Calamity's impatiently. Sit back down. You need to rest. Cast your mind back to previous rests. I have enjoyed. Yeah, nah, it's not even ointment. Is drawing self. Be reminded that Camp pulled 20 bone splinters out of you and said there were still a dozen left. No, Nagazumas can get them out, or maybe not, added Gideon a bit wildly. Might as well leave them in until I'm through getting people bumped off. Am I right? Nice. She indulged herself and storming out past the warden of the 6th and in careering down the hallway like a bomb. It was about the least dignified way to leave a perfectly normal conversation, but it was also really satisfying, and it got her out of there in record time. Gideon staggered down the hallway, picking orange goo out of her fingernails, and it was in this scratchy frame of mind that she nearly knocked down Silas Octakizaron in his floaty bactericidal 8th house whites. Column the 8th flanked him, automatically looking more like jaundice than ever in the same color. They are dead, then his uncle said by way of hello. The only thing that saved Gideon from howling like an animal was the relief that finally she would get the chance to shove one of Octakizaron's feet so deep into his ass he'd be garbling with his calcaneus. They had names, you lily livid, tooth-colored asshole, she said, and if you want to make a thing about it, I warn you that I'm in the kind of mood that can only be alleviated by walloping you. Column blinked. His necromancer did not. I had heard that you were speaking now, he said. It seems a pity. Save your grocery for someone else. Gideon, nerve. I've no interest in the frightened rantings of a 9th house thrall. What did you call me? Troll, said Silas, serf servant. I don't want a bunch of synonyms, you smarmy cloud-looking motherfucker, said Gideon. You said Gideon enough. Vilain continued. The necromancer of the house of the 8th, warming to his thesaurus column, was staring at Gideon almost cross-eyed with disbelief. Foundling, I am not insulting you. I am naming you for what you are. The replacement for Otto Snyganet himself, a poor representative of a fetid house of betrayers and mystics. Gideon's brain skidded to a halt. It went back again to Dribba, sitting with a fat lip and wicked friction burns on her wrists. The cries of the dwindling faithful green lights in the powdery dark, the greasy smell of incense, a woman weeping, someone stealing her getaway shuttle 1,000,000 years ago, to someone's one sadder immigrants, to the 9th house themselves. She still has family back on the 8th. You've been listening to Sister Glorica, she said slowly. I talked to Glorica on her return to the mother house, said Silas, and now I'd like to talk to you, me the troll, the servant. The other 5 words you said. Yes, said the boy, because you grew up servant to a murderer in a tribe of murderers. You are more than anything a victim of the 9th house that stopped the tiny bone, and Gideon's soul snapping, that stopped her from striding forward and bawling, both hands in the exquisite linen and chill mail of his robes, that, and the fact that she hadn't been straight up shield bashed yet by Column the 8th and wasn't in a hurry to experience this exciting time. She stepped forward. Silas did not step. Away, but he turned his head a little from her, as though she wore a bad breath. He had very brown eyes, startlingly framed by thick whitish lashes. "Don't pretend like you know what happened to me there," she said. "Glorica never remembered I was alive. Didn't care about me when she remembered, and she wouldn't have said anything to you on the subject. You don't know anything about me, and you don't know anything about the House of the Ninth. You are wrong on both points," said Silas to somewhere over her shoulder. "Prove it. You are invited to come and take tea with myself and Brother Ash." She scrubbed both her dirty fists into her eyes and narrowly avoided gumming one up with the terrible orangey salve, which was so noxious that it apparently caused splinters to leap from her body rather than hang around near it. Her corneas misted up momentarily with the smell. "Sorry, didn't hear you right," she said, "because I thought you said come and take tea with myself and Brother Ash. The dumbest thing to say ever. You are invited to come and take tea with myself and Brother Ash," Silas repeated with the kind of hard patience that indicated a mantra going on inside his pallid head. "You will not bring the daughter of the locked tomb, but you'll bring yourself, and you will be ready to listen. No price, no hidden motive, just an invitation to become more than what you are now, which is," Silas said, "the tool of your oppressors, the lock on your own collar." She couldn't handle anymore, having already lived a long night and suffered a number of emotional torments, among them supernatural murder and petty interpersonal drama. Gideon shrugged her cloak over her shoulders, thrust her free hand into a pocket, and stalked down the corridor. Away from any uncles and nephews, the necromancer's voice drifted down after her. "Will you come and listen to what I have to say? Be decisive." "Eat me, milkman," said Gideon, and staggered around the corner. She heard columns means yes, probably, but not. The murmured reply from that time on Gideon could not outfight the nightmare. She wheeled her subconscious to sink into a pattern of random eye movement that did not involve her waking up in a lather of cold sweat, but like so many things in her life, now it had lost fitness and apt response. She was dumb before the body of her failures, unmanned by the barrage of her brain. Gideon only had to close her eyes to see her own personal randomly selected shitshow. Magnus Quinn, still drinking his grassy morning tea, stabbed until his chest was steaming chunks of meat, because she could not make her tongue yell. "Look behind you," a steaming cauldron filled with fragrant grain, and the silent fetal corpse of Abigail Pent sinking beneath the surface. Before Gideon's blistering fingers could dig, her clear eyes Tetris gulping and swallowing from an upturned jug of acid that she was unable to wrench from his febrile, trembling hands. John Marie Chatter, whose dismembered arms and legs kept turning up while Gideon made a bed that got stickier and wetter and more jumbled with bits of John Marie as the covers were turned, and the old dream of her mother alive now overlapping with her life in a way she hadn't in reality. Shrieking, "Gideon! Gideon, Gideon!" While as Gideon watched, Crones of the Ninth gently levered her skull from the rest of her head with a big crunchy crack, and hear it telling her to wake up. That had only happened to the once the ninth necromancer sitting in the dark, wrapped in a moldering duvet like a cloak, her face very naked and blank, and shorn of its monochrome skull mural. Gideon had fallen back into an uneasy sleep almost immediately. She could never decide if she had dreamed that into being. Her heart was not exploding or having her intestines dripped out of her ears like streamers, was lofting off her skin right down to her subcutaneous fat. But she had been looking at Gideon with a collide expression of absolute pity. There had been something very weary and soft about the way that Hero Nana Jesmus had looked at her, then something that would have been understanding had it not been so tired and cynical. "It's just me," she'd said impatiently. "Go back to sleep." All signs pointed toward hallucination at that. Gideon had to sleep because the consequences of waking were too hideous. But from then on she slept wearing her rapier, her gauntlet on her chest, like a heavy obsidian heart. Chapter 27. "Let's negotiate," said Calamity Sextus Harrow. And Gideon sat in the sixth house's quarters, which was bizarre as hell as an experience. The sixth had been housed in high airy rooms, tucked into the curve of the central tower. Their windows opened onto a sweeping view of the sea, or at least they would have had the sixth not covered them up with blackout curtains. The whole of the sixth was huddled on the polar caps of a planet so close to Dominicus that exposure to the light side would melt the house clean away. The great libraries were set in a fat cake tin of a station, designed for the ongoing ordeal of not letting anything get too hot or too cold, which meant no windows at all, whatsoever Calamides and Camilla had recreated that effect in here to the best of their ability, which meant a room with the airiness and lightness of a closet. This was not helped by the fact that nearly every square inch was covered by flimsy Palamides' scribbles were tacked up like wallpaper across every bare surface. They were taped to tables. They clustered over the mirror. Fat books lay in serried rows on the arms of every chair, stacked haphazardly, as though nobody ever sat down without bringing another one to bear. Gideon had peeped through the open door of the bedroom into a dark nest where a huge whiteboard stared down at the ancient wheezing four-poster bed, very neatly made. There was no question about whether or not Camilla inhabited the horrible court attached to the N Cavalier style. It sagged beneath assorted weapons and tins of metal polish. "I'm not moving from my outline," said Hiroshi, and Palamity sat on either side of a table swept hastily clear of books and notes. Stray pens rolled across the surface. "At the least jolt, I hold the keys. We enter. Together you get an hour, and I was not remotely sufficient. You're slow, you're paranoid. I am currently alive," said Harrow. "Hark," and Gideon winced. Calamides had taken off his spectacles 10 minutes into the argument, and he was now cleaning them on the front of his robe. This appeared to be more of an aggressive move than a defensive one. His eyes, free of glass plates, were arrestingly gray. It mainly only hurt Gideon, who was trying very badly to avoid his gaze. "So you are the room in and of itself is of interest to me, and it ought to be of interest to you," he said. "You're too forensic. You lack scope. Give over Nona Yazimus a key for key swap is the most logical and most elegant arrangement here. This refusal is just superstition and paranoia, cooked up with a side of pure humbuggery." For a moment, Gideon's anger and remorse were overwhelmed by, "Did you legit just say pure humbuggery?" The necromancers were now mirroring each other's equally bowed postures, bony elbows on the table, hands clasped beneath their chins, staring at each other unblinking. Behind Palamides' chair, Camilla had the glazed expression of someone who had checked out 10 minutes ago. Her arm was bandaged, but not kept pinned up, and she appeared to have full range of movement with it. Gideon was lolling behind her, picking at her fingernails and staring at the pieces of paper, which had handwriting that was more like cryptography. Her own necromancer settled back and said, "Sepulchral, you are still convinced by your megatheorem, my dear? Then yes, aren't you? Know it's sensational, but not out of the question. Look, the tasks and challenges, the theories on depending them, they're really not that desperate. Neural amalgamation, transferal of energy, as we saw on the entropy field challenge, continuous siphoning, the magical theories astonishing. Nobody has pushed necromantic power this far. It's unsustainable if the intent is to show off the sheer breadth of liquoral power. Well, they did. I've seen the winnowing test, and if the self-replicating bone golem had been the only thing in it, I would still be kept up at night. I don't know how the hell they did it." "I do," said her, "and if my calculations are right, I can replicate it. But all this is more than unsustainable, Sextus. The things they've shown us would be powerful, would bespeak impossible depth of necromantic ability if they were replicable. These experiments, or demand a continuous flow of energy, they've hidden that source somewhere in the facility, and that's the true prize. Your secret door theory, very ninth," she bristled. "It's a simple understanding of area and space, including the facility. We've got access to maybe 30% of this tower. That's what's called hard evidence. Warden, your megatheorem is based on supposition, and your so-called instinct. Thanks anyway. I don't like how many of these spells are about sheer control," said Palamides. "Don't be feeble. Necromancy is control." Calamides slipped his spectacles back on. "Few maybe," he said. "I don't know. Some days. Look, Nonagismus, these theorems are all teaching us something. I believe they're parts of an overarching whole, like the whiteboard in the facility. Remember, it is finished. You believe they're giving us clues, prompts towards some deeper occult understanding that's hidden elsewhere. This power source idea. I see puzzle pieces. You see direction signs. Now maybe you're right, and we're meant to follow the crumbs to some master treasure. But if I'm right, if Liquorhood is nothing more or less than the synthesis of 8 individual theorems." Her did not speak. There was a long moment, and Gideon thought that Palamides had lapsed into thought. But then he said crisply, "Then is wrong. There's a flaw in the underlying logic. The whole thing is an ugly mistake." Now her necromancer said, "Leave the cryptic to the ninth. What mistake Sex does, I'll give you the relevant notes if you help me pick a lock," said Calamides. This was enough to give her Pause, give me your personal notes on all the theorems you've seen, what lock throw, and a copy of your map. Do I have a map? Harrow Hark remarked in general to the air. My goodness, that is at the very best a baseless assertion. Not an idiot, Reverend Daughter Electro. Lock the one that matches the 6th house key, the gray key which Silas Octachazaran currently holds, hence picking. That's impossible. How? You can't know until we do it. If it works, it gets you every single note on every theorem I've read in return for your cooperation. And the map, are you in? There was a pregnant pause, as everyone had already known beforehand. Gideon's necromancer was forced to admit that she was in. She rose to stand. The chair behind her teetered dangerously, and Gideon corrected it with her foot. At least show me the door you told me about, she commanded. I despise this feeling that the 6th house is taking my house for all it can get. Most people would have looked upon this as a generous deal, remarked Sextus, whose chair was being held back for him by the obliging Camilla. But I did owe you one for sticking by us when the 3rd house made its challenge. Not that we wouldn't have won it, but we would have given more than I'm willing to give. So that's the sticky sentiment part. Come with me for the cold hard facts. They all draped after him for the cold hard facts. When the 6th house locked their front door, it was grimly amusing to see that, as well as Palamides' wards. They had hammered in 5 deadlocks and reinforced the door so that it could not be taken off its hinges. Hearing Camilla shove all the bolts home was as good as an orchestra. The 2 necromancers drifted to the front, their long robes making them look like dreary gray birds, and Gideon and Camilla fell behind them, lingering beyond the mandated half-step. Camilla, the 6th shoulders were set, her straight dark fringe fell out of the way as she half-turned her face to Gideon, briefly expressionlessly. But that was all Gideon needed. Ask me how I am, and I'll scream. She said, how are you? Said Camilla, who was a pill. I see you calling my bluff, and I resent it, said Gideon. So hey, what do you really use when you're not pretending the rapier is your main wield? Do short blades of equal length, or one blade and one baton? Her keen eyes narrowed into black line slits. How did I mess up? She asked eventually. You drew your rapier and your dagger at the same time, and you're ambidextrous. You keep cutting like both your blades are curved. Also, there's 6 swords in a nightstick on your bed. Should have tidied my mess, admitted Camilla, to blades double-edged. Why, I mean, that's boss. But why? The other cavalier massaged her elbow, gingerly flexing her fingers as though to make sure there was no correlating pain. She seemed to be considering something, and then she came to an abrupt conclusion. I applied to be the warden's cavalier primary when I was 12, she said. Got accepted, which looked at the data on weapons before decided that 2 short blades had more general applications. I learned the rapier. That was an understatement. But I'll be fighting with the blades when the time comes to really fight. Before Gideon could get to grips with the disquieting implication, this was not yet the time to really fight. Camilla got in an elbow jab. Why are you acting like you and he are arguing? No, said Gideon brightly, followed up with a thanks. Because you're not arguing. Beat you'd know of. You were arguing. Can you? I don't know. Can you tell him that if he wants me to introduce him to Dulcie Meyer, I can do it? Can you tell him I'm not trying to cramp his freaking style? The last thing the warden needs, said Camilla, is an introduction to Lady Septimus. Then can you tell him to maybe stop acting like he read everyone's feelings in a book ages ago? Because that would be completely sweet, said Gideon. Without another word, Camilla moved to bookend her adapt as he paused before a large gilt-framed picture. The gilt was mostly brown, except where it had gone black, and the picture itself was so faded that it looked like a coffee stain. It was a curious image, a dusty expanse of rock cracked into an enormous canyon running down the center, a sepia river winding into flaked-off nothingness. At the very bottom, I documented this one a long time back, said Harry. Let's take another look. Calamides and Camilla each shouldered one corner of the portrait, lifting it off some unseen tack. It seemed very light, the great electoral door behind it with its black pillars and its carved horn skulls. Its graven images and grimstone was not particularly well hidden in all respects. It was a nearly exact match for the other electoral door Gideon had seen. But Harris sucked in her breath. She went to the lock, and then Gideon saw why it had been filled in with some hard, tarry gray stuff like putty or cement. Someone had deliberately tampered with the keyhole. Part of the putty had been chipped away at the bottom with great gouges taken out of it, but otherwise it seemed depressingly solid. There was no getting through that stuff Without significant engineering work, Six said her necromancer, it was not in this condition the first night we were in Canaan House. I still can't believe you documented every door in this place on the first night, said Palamides with one of his slight dry smiles. And that I didn't. I couldn't tell when the lock was first jammed. I thought I was losing my grip. Haru was already easing her gloves off, with her teeth flexing her long nervous fingers like a surgeon. She drew the pad of her thumb over the stuff, furrowed her brows so deeply that it could have held a pencil, and swore. Under her breath she tossed the gloves to Gideon. Gideon caught them neatly and depressed the matter with her thumb and forefinger. This, she said calmly, is regenerating ash, perpetual bone, which accounts for it being undateable, same stuff as the transferal construct, in which case whoever put this in place would need to have a comparable level of skill to whoever made the construct, said Hera. Getting it out again would require more power than most bone specialists hold in aggregate. I didn't bring you here to remove it, Sex. Just said I just brought you here to confirm what you've done. Nicely, thank you. Excuse me, I never said I couldn't remove it. One eyebrow went up above the thick spectacles. You don't think it was the hierarch of old who responded, the one who walked down dusty ninth house halls as though crushing purple silk beneath her feet? Sextus, she said blandly, I am embarrassed for you that you can't. She clapped her hand over the ghoul of bone matter welted over the log, then she drew it back, and with all the self-affinity of chewing gum or glue, it traveled back with her hand, a gummy web of about a finger's length, the point of origin vibrating madly as a bead of sweat appeared at her temple. Calamity, Sex just sucked in a breath, and then the stuff snapped back like flexible plastic rubbering together suddenly in an immovable lump. Her tried again. Her fingers kept flexing in and out, impotently kneading as she turned her head away and closed her eyes. She stretched the stuff away a whole hand's length, and then it broke, reformed, scattered back like a reverse explosion. She tried again and again and again. After that, the paint on Hera's forehead was shiny with blood sweat. Now it bubbled up in grayish-pink rivulets as shown around each nostril. Before she knew what she was doing, Gideon found that she had moved in to flank her, hiding what she was doing from Sextus's impassive gaze, rolling up the long black sleeve of her ninth cloak, mouth moving before her brain did. Battery up, she muttered. It was the first thing Gideon had said to her since Hera had stalked from the sixth house quarters, taught with what it seemed to be the world's most dismissive disappointment, a disdainful black crow of a girl. Her adept opened one baleful black eye. Pardon, I said, saddle up, Sunshine. Come on, you know what to do. I manifestly don't, and never tell me to saddle up, Sunshine, ever again. I'm saying to you, siphon me. Have Six the watching, said Gideon brutally at the last remark, which was a sledgehammer of a statement, not a stiletto. Hohark fell silent. Her expression was resentful in a way that her cavalier could not understand, except to pass it as grim hatefulness. That once again the only path open to her was that of using her cavalier, a girl who had screwed up so badly as to provide the universe at large with a new understanding of screw up. All she said was, you don't have to roll up your sleeve, you nincompoop. And then the leeching, squirming feeling of siphoning began. It was just as bad as the first time, but unquestionably shorter than her as long and awful walk from one side of the evulsion room to the other. And now Gideon knew what to expect. The pain was a familiar brand of terrible. She did not cry out, though that probably would have been more dignified. Instead, she toned it down to a series of wheezes and grunts as her necromancer took something from her that sandpapered her soul. Her blood boiled in her veins, then froze abruptly and grazed her innards. With each pump of her heart, Harrow-Hark curved her fingers, and she pulled at the end of a very long moment. She held an inert sphere of compressed ash and bone, gray and pockmarked, tamed to submission. The lock was as clear and as clean as though the obstruction had never existed. The pair from the sixth stared at them. Eventually Palamides leaned down to squint through the newly cleared keyhole. Don't get used to using her that way. Known as Izimus, he said, and disapproval had crept into his voice. It's not good theory, and it's not good morals. It was Gideon who said, you're sounding more and more like Silas Octokaiserin. Ouch, said Palamides sincerely. Then he straightened up. Well, it's off for good or for ill. Maybe we should have left it on, but I want to make it them. Whatever nervous, even a supernatural force is vulnerable. He let his finger rest on the log. Did you hide the last key to? He asked it quietly. Or are we racing you to it? Well, move faster, dickhead. Camilla cleared her throat. Maybe, Because her necromancer was talking to a door, he dropped his hand. "Oh, you another 1/9," he said to her skull-faced necromancer. "You get a free question. It's unattractive to set yourself up as the repository of all knowledge. Sex to set up nothing. How many keys are in play now?" Calamity suddenly grinned. It was a curious act of alchemy that turned his raw-boned plain face into something magnetic, very nearly good-looking. Instead of being the act of 3 jawbones meeting a chin, "We've got 3, he said. "You've got 2, or you did, until you gave 1 to Lady Septimus. As per the agreement, she'd offered me first. You should have haggled for more. By the way, she offered me a look at the keys she already had. But I suspect you didn't need her to sweeten the deal." Harrow didn't react. The Gideon bet she was swearing up a storm in some vile crypt of her brain. The 8th had won, and now they've got 2 more through trickery. Dawson airs. "But that still leaves 1 spare," the 3rd suggested. Harry, "Nope. Come, heard them talking this morning. They've got nothing, and it's not the 2nd unless they lied to me after the duel, which you know 2nd, so watch your back. The 2nd is still looking for a way to shut the whole thing down. The 3rd don't like coming last, and the 8th will take anything and justify the cost." He frowned. "It's the 3rd I'm least certain of. I don't know which twin to watch out for." "The big one," said Harrow without hesitation. Gideon was pretty sure both twins were the same size, and was surprised to discover that even the unatomous gaze of Harrow Harknana Josimus was not immune to the radiance coming off Princess Corona there. Both only middling necromancers, but the big one is the dominant. She says the sister says we. Honestly, a good point. Still not sure. Maybe tomorrow night we'll start the theorem exchange. 9th, I've got to think. The missing key, said Hera. The missing key. After the brief goodbyes, both of the 6th house turned away in their drab grays, until much to Gideon's acute dislike, Calamity spun around. He had not met her eye the whole time, maybe out of service to the fact that she was avoiding his, but now he looked her dead in the face. She swallowed down the urge to say, "I'm sorry, I don't hate you, I just kind of hate me right now." Instead, she coolly looked away, which was the opposite of an apology. "Keep an eye on her, Nav," said Palamedes quickly. And then he turned to catch up with Camilla. "He's getting presumptuous," to the Reverend daughter watching their retreating backs. "I think he wasn't talking about you." They kept a long and drawn-out silence, as unwillingly stretchy as the ashes and bone shards that had been clumped over the keyhole. "Good point," said Harry. "That reminds me, I now officially ban you from seeing Lady Septimus. Are we having this conversation? Are we really having this conversation?" Harry's face was pinched into an expression of deliberate patience. "Nev," she said, "take it from me, Dulcimer Septimus is dangerous. You're nuts, doesn't I? Septimus can't even blow her nose. I'm sick of how weird you're getting over this. And yet you've never thought about how she still managed to get a key. How am I being weird?" "I don't know," said Gideon, heartily fed up with the whole thing. "I don't know. Maybe it's because whenever she's mentioned you effortlessly tick both boxes for jealous and creep. If you looked in a dictionary, you'd find it's envious. And I'm hardly envious of no is 100% jealous," said Gideon recklessly, "on account of how you're always doing this when it looks like she's taking up my time." There was a horrible pause. "I have been Lex," said her necromancer, steadily ignoring this last statement like it was a dump Gideon had taken. In the hallway, she took her gloves from Gideon's awkward hands and slipped them back over her fingers. "I have indulged myself in apathy while you attached yourself to every weirdo in Canaan House. You cannot possibly call anyone a weirdo," said Gideon. "No more. We now have less to hide, but more to lose. She's got nobody. If that thing comes after her, is a death sentence." "Yes, she has no cavalier now," said Hera. "Is not a question of if, it's a question of when. Let the dead reclaim the dead." "He won't take my word when I've proven my judgment before." "Fine, you're still Bart from her sick room." "No," said Gideon. "Nah, nope, denied. That's not me. You're not her bodyguard." "I never pledged to be yours either," said Gideon. "Nor really." "Yes, you did." Snapped her a heart. "You agreed to act as my cavalier primary. You agreed to devote yourself to the duties of a cavalier. Your misunderstanding of what that entailed does not make you any less beholden to what your duty actually is. A promise to fight for you. You promised me my freedom. There's a hell of a good chance that I'm not going to get it, and I know it. We're all dying here. Something's after us. The only thing I can do is try to keep as many of us as I can alive for as long as I can, and hope that we work something out. You're the ignorant sack of eyeballs who doesn't understand what a cavalier is." "Harrow, you just take whatever I give you." "Melodrama Grizzle never became, you said her adept flatly. You've never complained about any of our previous transactions, my transactions. What happened to I cannot afford to not have you trust me now. I'm going to make awkward eye contact and act like you broke my nose just because you hugged me once. An indrawn breath. Don't mock you. I should kick your ass for you. I'm making a reasonable request, said Harahark, who had taken her gloves off and on again 3 times and was now examining her fingernails as though bored. The only reason Gideon had not already tried to deck her was that her eyelashes were trembling in rage, and also because she'd never hit her before and was tremendously afraid that once she started she wouldn't stop. I ask you to draw back and reprioritize the 9th and what, as you said, is a dangerous time. I've got my priorities straight. Nothing you have done in the past 2 days suggests that. Gideon went cold. Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. I didn't mean to let you Marie die, for God's sake. I didn't mean fuck you, Gideon added again for emphasis. She found herself laughing in that awful highway that was totally devoid of humor. Fuck, we don't deserve to still be around. Have you realized that yet? Have you realized that this whole thing has been about the union of Necromancer and Cavalier from start to finish? We should be toast if they're measuring this on the strength of that. We're the Walking Dead. Magnus V was a better Cavalier than I am. John Marie IV was 10 times the Cavalier I am. They should be alive, and we should be bacteria food to big bags of alga mortis. We're alive through dumb luck, and genre isn't, and you're acting like me letting Dulcinea dies. All that standing between you and Lictahood. Stop worshipping the sound of your own voice, Nev, and listen to me. Hello, I hate you so, Gideon. I never stopped hating you. I will always hate you, and you will always hate me. Don't forget that. It's not like I ever can. Harris' mouth twisted so much that it should have been a reef knot. Her eyes closed briefly, and she sheathed her hands inside her gloves. The tension should have deflated then, but it didn't. Like a pricked boil, it got full and shiny and hot. Gideon found she had swallowed 6 times in 10 seconds, and that the inside of her chest felt dry and bright. Her Necromancer said evenly, Riddle, you're incorrect. How nothing stands between myself and Lickerhood, said Harrowhack, and you are not a part of the equation. Don't get carried away by the sixth's ideas. The tests are not concerned with some frankly sickening rubric of sentiment and obedience. They're testing me, and me alone. By the end, neither I nor the 9th will need you for this pantomime. You may hate me all you wish. I still don't even remember about you half the time. She turned away from Gideon. She did not walk away, but stood there for a moment in the simple arrogance of showing the other girl her back, of giving Gideon, with a sword in her scabbard, unfettered access to the back of her rib cage. Harry said, you're banned from seeing Septimus. The quicker she shuffles off, the better. If I were in her position, I would have already thrown myself out the window. Stand in front of a window now, and I'll do the hard part, said Gideon. Oh, take a nap, snapped her heart. Gideon very nearly did lay hands on her then, and probably should have. If you don't need me, release me to the 7th house, she said, very slow and very calm, like she was reading at a service. I'd rather serve Dulcinea dying than the living. Reverend daughter Harrowhark turned to leave eerily, casually, rarely, as though she and Gideon had finished a conversation about the weather. But then she inclined her head back to Gideon a little, and the fragment of her expression that Gideon saw was as wheezing and airless as a blow to the solar plexus. When I release you from my service, Nav, her Necromancer said, you will know about it. And she walked away. Gideon decided then, and there her Betrayal, chapter 28. Half an hour later, Gideon Nerve stood before the doors of the 8th house quarters in front of an extremely befuddled column. The 8th in the mystery-red recesses of her mind. This treacherous act was the correct thing to do, though she couldn't yet quite decide why. Your uncle wanted me, she said, so here I am. The Cavalier looked at her. She had obviously interrupted him in the middle of some domestic housekeeping, which would have been extremely funny at any other time. The flawless white leather and scale mail cauldrons were gone. He was in his white breeches and a slightly dingy undershirt, and was holding a very oily cloth. The shabbiness of the cloth and the undershirt looked even dingier against the scintillating 8th whiteness of the trousers. She had never been alone with Column the 8th before. Outside his uncle's shadow, he was just as patchy and discolored as though he had a liver inflammation. He was still a leathery yellow-brown, and his hair was similar, which made him look the same all over. It was starting to realize that he was maybe a little younger than Magnus He looked worn out and secondhand. You came alone, he said in his perpetually scratchy voice. You'd know if my necromancer was here. Yes, said Callum. He looked as though he were on the verge of saying something, and then decided against it. Instead, he said, sword hand second please. What on that disarming look, he said, I'd be a fool not to make you bear with me. That's not part of the deal. There's nothing in here to hurt you, said Callum. I swear it by my owner, so give over. There was nothing likable about the wiry rewind man, but there was something sincere about him, and also he had maybe the worst job in the history of the world. Gideon did not trust him, but she handed over her rapier, and she handed over her glove, and she trotted after him unwillingly. The red fog was clearing a little, and now Gideon was regretting the rage that had taken her from Harrow to teacher, and from teacher's directions to the rooms that housed the 8th house. They had been put in high-voltage squarish rooms, with very high windows, airy and gracious. What furniture they had been given would remain a mystery, because they'd gotten rid of it. All the living space had been mopped, until it hurt. It was baffling to see such cleanliness in Canaan House. Someone had even given them a pot of furniture polish, and the wooden floorboards beneath Gideon's feet smelled oiled and fresh. They had kept a writing desk and chair, and a table, and 2 stools, and that was all. The table was covered with a white cloth. There was a book on the writing desk. The rest was prim and sparse. The only splash of color was an enormous portrait of the emperor, as kindly master, with that expression of beatific peace. It was placed directly opposite the table, so that anyone sitting there would have him as an unavoidable dinner guest. In one corner was a polished metal box, with Callum's targe sitting precariously on a nest of handweights. Her sword and glove were both placed carefully next to the door, which she appreciated. Callum disappeared into another room. He reappeared a few minutes later with Silicinto kitted out in his perpetual uniform of cornea white silk and silver white chain, earned his long floating wings of a robe. Gideon must have caught him mid-ablutions, because his chalk-colored hair was wet and tousled, as though it had just been rubbed with the towel. It seemed frivolously long, and she realized she had never seen it except pinned back. He pulled over the chair from the writing desk and sat while his cavalier produced a comb from somewhere, sorting out the still damp locks of thin white. Silas looked as though he had not slept well lately. Shadows beneath the eyes made his sharp and relentless chin sharper, and even more relentless. You must be aware that I would never suffer a shadow cultist in an 8th sanctuary, he said, unless I thought it was of huge moral utility. Thanks, said Gideon. Can I say it? You may give me a moment, said Callum. I'll finish up, then make the tea. She squeaked a stool away from the table, willfully working the back legs into the shining wood. The necromancer shut his eyes as though the sound hurt him. I was never part of the Loch-Tuin congregation, she said, settling herself down. If you had talked to Sister Glorica, you would have known that, having combed the hair to his satisfaction. Callum began separating sections of the back with the teeth of the comb. Silas ignored this treatment, as though it happened so often it was not worth attention. Gideon once again thanked her lucky stars that she had not had a traditional cavalier's training. A rock does not have to make a vow that it is a rock, said Silas tiredly. You are what you are. Take your hood off, please. The police was second cousin to an afterthought. Gideon pulled back her hood a little, unwillingly letting it fall on her shoulders, with the now strange feeling of a nude head. Silas's eyes were not on her face, now fully exposed, but on her hair, which badly needed a trim.